At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It is not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 6 on the agenda this morning is detailed scrutiny of the Anti-Evictions Bill 2018 and the Residential Tenancies, Greater Security of Tenure and Rent Certainty Bill 2018. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome Deputy Jan O'Sullivan and Deputy Mick Wallace to present their bills. Or Deputy Mick Barry, sorry. Note on privilege before we begin. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Deputy Jan O'Sullivan to make her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair. And first of all, I'd just like to thank the Chair and members of the committee for inviting me along to present for detailed consideration and scrutiny of my bill, which is its purpose is to rebalance the landlord-tenant relationship by providing for greater security of tenure and rent certainty for tenants. And I'm aware that obviously Deputy Barry's bill, and indeed the Minister has a bill as well, and a number of other opposition parties have presented bills across this area. But I mean, that is largely because there are so many individuals and families now who are in a situation where they're both insecure and in fear of becoming homelessness because of insecurity in the private rented sector. So the bill I'm presenting covers a wide range of measures that I believe are urgent and necessary to provide transparency, security from eviction and protection from unfair rents and unfair deposits. So I suppose in my written submission to you, I gave some background which I think is important in the context of often arguments are made that certain things are not constitutional because of the balance of property rights versus the public interest in the Constitution. So I refer to the All-Party Oireachtas Committee on the Constitution report of 2004, which basically said that and concluded that the power of the Oireachtas to impose restrictions on property rights in the public interest was constitutionally well established. And that report, I was actually a member of that All-Party Oireachtas Committee, and we had a lot of very eminent legal advice from constitutional lawyers, and we also looked at a number of precedents and cases. And as I said, the conclusion, it recommended that the Kenny report could be implemented, but also generally that the Constitution shouldn't be used as a shelter and an excuse for inaction in terms of the rights of the public versus the rights of private property. So basically that's the background, but I also wanted to refer to a document that the Oireachtas Library and Research Service gave us entitled Private Rental Sector and International Comparative Study. And basically it looks at the impact of the European Convention on Human Rights and the various provisions in that, and how decisions around these issues need to be also in harmony with European Court judgments. And basically recent decisions of the European Court of Human Rights affirm that interference with property rights is authorised if it's in accordance with the law, is necessary in a democratic society and is proportionate to the aim sought. And it also goes on to outline the regulations of the private rented sector in various countries across Europe, which I think is very useful because there is an awful lot more security for tenants in most of our European neighbours. And for example, there's an example of Germany, where the private rented sector comprises 41% of the housing stock, and renting is considered a secure and long-term option. And, you know, if just to give the example of Germany, it has strong contract protection and rent control. There's a database of all the rents in the local area, tracking all rents agreed in the preceding 4 years. Landlords determine a rent for their property by referencing dwelling, that's the reference rent concept, dwellings of comparable size, quality and location, and rent may not exceed the reference rent in the locality by more than 10%. And interestingly, and I know we'll have the landlords' representatives later on, but the law, it also points out that the law benefits landlords as well as tenants. And, you know, I think there is an argument for some rights to landlords as well, and recognising landlords and the costs to them. And in Germany, for example, there are depreciation allowances, mortgage interest, tax relief, deduction of maintenance costs, and the possibility to deduct losses from the income tax base. So I suppose, you know, there is a balance in other European countries. So the point I'm making really is that the proposal in our bill are far from being abnormal from an international comparative perspective. So now just to briefly go through the provisions of the bill, and some of them overlap with Deputy Barry's bill and others. In section 1, we want to commence the portion of the Residential Tenancies Act that hasn't been commenced, particularly in relation to a deposit protection scheme, which would come into operation within 6 months. Obviously, that is provided for already, but hasn't been enacted. Secondly, we would introduce a new definition of a landlord, which would deal with the issue of receivers. And again, that's been raised by many people here in this room. And Threshold and other bodies have said that the extent, if any, to which a receiver is bound by the tenancy agreement is uncertain, and the tenant's rights in relation to adequate notice, upkeep of the property, deposit return and so on may be ignored. So we want to include a definition, the definition of a landlord to include a receiver. Thirdly, we want to have a definition of a deposit. And we're saying that that deposit must not exceed, in any case, 1 month's rent under the tenancy, because we heard reports of people looking for 2 or 3 months' rent, basically to deter people who can't afford to have that kind of money up front. Sections 5 and 6 deal with rent control. The rent pressure zones, and again, other parties here have made the same proposal that increases, which currently are limited to 4% in rent pressure zones, should be linked to the annual rate of inflation as measured by the All-Item Consumer Price Index published by the CSO. We also propose that for a 3-year period, the entire country should be designated as a rent pressure zone. And coming from the city of Limerick, I think you'll understand why I feel very strongly about that particular issue. The next set of measures then deal with security of tenure. Most of them, I say they're not original. I believe there is a consensus that includes many parties and members as to the need for most, if not all, of these proposals. And again, some of them are in Deputy Barry's bill. In section 7, we propose that the Part 4 tenancy effectively would become a tenancy of indefinite duration. We also propose to delete paragraph 3 in the table to section 34, which permits a landlord to terminate a tenancy on the ground of an intention to sell the property within 3 months. So basically, we're saying that sale should not be a ground for giving a notice of termination of tenancy to a tenant. And just to quote briefly from the NESC recommendations in this regard, they recommended that, they say, one view is that this could reduce the price that those selling rental properties could achieve compared to the price with vacant possession. On the other hand, the more the Irish rental system is driven by long-term yield rather than changing asset prices, the higher the value purchasers will put on properties with an existing secure rental stream. And also, obviously, there's the insecurity for the tenant, but we would also argue that it does actually, make more long-term security for the landlord as well. Then also in that area, we deal with the issue of refurbishment to renovate the property. And again, I would note that the Minister also has a definition now in his bill in that regard. But our definition would say that termination is permissible on this ground only if no reasonable measures can be taken to maintain the dwelling fit for human habitation during the refurbishment or renovation. And I suppose I would make the point that in our own homes, if you have a private home You generally don't move out of your house if you're doing fairly significant renovations, so we don't think tenants should have to move out either. And finally, just in relation to that whole area of security of tenure, we narrowed the definition of where a family member is moving into the property. Currently it's very broad. It includes things like sister, nephew, niece, etc., parent-in-law, etc. So we would shorten it just to be the spouse or civil partner or a child, including a stepchild, foster child or adopted child of the landlord. And since Section 9 then provides for a rent register, and it would be a dwelling-specific rent register, which is what Threshold are very much arguing for. But it would protect the identity of the landlord and of the tenant. So that is basically what's in the bill. It's comprehensive because obviously there are a number of difficulties and insecurities that face tenants in particular. And I think everybody here agrees that we need legislative reform. So this is our contribution in this particular area, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'd now like to call on Deputy Barry for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. Evidence from all of the agencies funded by the Government to deal with homelessness show that the vast majority of homelessness is caused by evictions from the private rented sector. For example, according to Focus Ireland, which is funded by the Government as the main agency dealing with family homelessness, 69% of homeless families, quote, reported that their last stable home was in the private rented sector. Chair, traditionally the number of evictions into homelessness peaks in the month of January. If that has happened again this year, the official homelessness figures for the state will surge over the 10,000 mark when the January information is released next week. And what I'm saying here is that it is insanity, really, to continue to allow economic evictions take place in the midst of the greatest housing and homelessness crisis in the history of the state. And this bill aims to address that issue and try and staunch the flow. Now, the level of precarity in the private rented sector is illustrated by the fact that the majority of tenants have been renting their current home for less than 2 years. By contrast, only 5% of mortgaged owner-occupiers and only 11% of local authority tenants have been living in their current home for less than 3 years. This fast rate of turnover is persisting despite the fact that more and more people are living permanently in the private rented sector. An April 2018 survey of tenants by Threshold found 70% had been renting for 5 years or longer. In other words, families are being uprooted and forced to move over and over again. This insecurity of tenure is particularly sharp for HAP, RAS and rent supplement tenants who find it hardest to source private rented accommodation and are most likely to end up homeless as a result. These tenants now make up between a quarter and a third of the private rented sector due to the collapse of council housing construction under Fine Gael and the privatisation of social housing. Now, the bill aims to target 4 of the main reasons for evictions from the private rented sector and into homelessness. Focus Ireland's research shows that 1/3 of homeless families became homeless after being evicted from the private rented sector for reasons covered by this bill. This is a quote from their research. Because the private rented home was being removed from the market due to the landlord selling, the landlord's property being repossessed or sold by a bank, the landlord moving back in, major renovations, or the landlord giving the property to a family member. So in other words, our bill would help to keep 1/3 of families currently being made homeless in their homes. Likewise, if our bill had been enforced in 2017 when its first iteration was moved, well over half of the families or individuals contacting Threshold after being threatened with eviction would have been protected. The bill would also cover the reasons cited in 40% of all eviction notices disputed with the RTB. So let's look at some of the issues. Number one, a landlord claiming that they want to sell. This bill would ban sale of property as a reason for eviction. The property can still be sold with tenants in situ, as in other European countries, for example, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark. According to Threshold's 2017 annual report published last week, these notes are rather old, according to Threshold's 2017 annual report published last year, sale of the property was the most common reason given in eviction notices, used in 38% of eviction notices it dealt with. In other words, nearly 2,000 families or households faced with eviction on grounds of sale and would have been protected by the first iteration of this bill if the government hadn't voted it down in January 2017. According to Focus Ireland, the largest single push factor into homelessness remains families being evicted into homelessness from the private rental sector where landlords are selling up. And further, that without structural changes to reduce this inflow into homelessness, it will be hard to make further progress in reducing total homelessness. So I think that speaks for itself. Second key issue, the bill gives tenants of buy-to-lets in receivership the protections of the Residential Tenancies Act by including banks and receivers in the definition of landlords as called for by Threshold. This would remedy the current situation where landlords essentially lose all their rights if their landlord defaults on a loan and their home is repossessed by a bank. The latest central bank figures show 12,732 buy-to-let mortgages in long-term arrears over 2 years. The majority are tenanted with the occupants at risk of eviction on grounds of sale and or because of the lack of RTA protection for tenants of BTLs in receivership. This bill would give tenants in this situation the same security of tenure as other tenants, as well as the other RTA protections, for example, in relation to deposits and repairs. On the issue of a landlord claiming they have a relative who wants to move in, this bill would oblige landlords to pay 6 months' rent in compensation to the tenant if they want to break a lease for this purpose. The idea behind this is to prevent unscrupulous landlords from using the relative argument as an excuse to evict tenants in order to get in new tenants on a higher rent. On the question of renovation, the bill also removes renovation and refurbishment as grounds for eviction. This is an addition to the original anti-eviction bill of January 2017, but it's necessary now in light of the major increase in so-called renovictions. 12% of threshold eviction queries in 2017 related to refurbishment or renovation. 8% of eviction notices determined on by the RTB in 2017 cited substantial refurbishment. An outrageous 74%, by the way, were found to be invalid. In most cases, refurbishments can be done without any need for the tenant to move out and certainly without any need to terminate a tenancy. Tenants could still move out to allow major refurbishment, but this should only happen with the consent of the tenant. Otherwise, the landlord should wait until the end of the tenancy to renovate. In the event of health and safety or fire issues, this could be dealt with under the relevant legislation in those areas rather than the Residential Tenancies Act. On the issue of landlords giving notice just before the expiry of a 4 to 6 year Part 4 tenancy, landlords can currently evict tenants for no reason at the end of 4 or 6 year Part 4 tenancies. This bill makes Part 4 tenancies indefinite so that this recurring eviction period or danger zone for long-term tenants would no longer exist. Other measures in the bill include purpose-built student accommodation to be placed under the Residential Tenancies Act. This would ensure the tenancy protections of the Residential Tenancies Act as amended in this bill, including rent pressure zones, for example, applied to the nearly 40,000 students living in student-specific accommodation, whether private or publicly owned, for example, by the colleges. According to a survey of students carried out by USI in 2017, this would cover about a third of students. I understand we have a USI speaker coming in, so I won't elaborate on that. I'm sure she will do so. So, moving towards a conclusion, the bill would reduce the time frame for Part 4 tenancy protections coming into effect from 6 months to 2. At present, landlords can evict tenants for no reason during the first 6 months of a tenancy. Threshold's latest survey of tenants in April 2018 found that nearly half, 46%, have been living in their current home for 1 year or less. I think that this is a necessary change. An additional reason for amending the law so that Part 4 tenancies kick in after 2 months is that we anticipate that if this bill passes, landlords might try to circumvent the increased protections for tenants it contains by getting in new tenants every 6 months, some landlords certainly. So this is a way of future-proofing the bill. And finally, the bill extends notice periods landlords have to give when terminating tenancies. I won't go into all the details there. The tables are laid out in the bill itself. And to restate, we feel there is a need for this legislation. We are in the middle of the greatest housing and homelessness crisis in the history of the state. The number one cause of the increase in homelessness is eviction from the private rented sector. This bill aims to staunch that flow, in particular by tackling two of the main reasons cited on those notices to quit, namely evictions on grounds of sale of property and evictions on grounds of renovation, so-called renovictions. Let's ban that. That is a sensible and practical proposal in the current climate.
Thank you, Deputy Barry. Our first person is Deputy O'Dowd. Members, just before we start, we're scrutinising the two bills that are before us. We're not going into general policy, but just the bills that are before us. Okay. And Deputy Ellis, your substitution for Deputy O'Brien, aren't you? Deputy O'Dowd.
Thank you, Chairperson. I just want to comment on some of the points that were made here. I agree absolutely. We're in a very significant housing crisis, the worst in the history of the state. And I acknowledge and appreciate fully the points that have been made, and I just want to make a few points. First of all is that there are actions have been taken to protect and to help tenants, and obviously to be able to pay the rent is the first one, and I think that the HAP initiative has been very successful. It allows people who would not otherwise ever be able to meet the increased rents that are being demanded. It allows them to compete in the marketplace as equal players as anybody else. I think the RTB, its powers have been strengthened, and I think there's over 340,000 tenancies registered with them, and it is proposed to increase the powers to regulate the sector and to increase the rights of tenants, and I think that is very useful and helpful as well. The rent pressure zones, I know Deputy Sullivan mentioned them. I mean, they've been very successful where they have extended, and certainly in Drogheda that they've been, I believe, very successful, and the number of people who are complaining about increased rents has significantly reduced as a result. And also I think the point that local authorities and private builders right around the country are significantly increasing the number of houses that have been built. When you were Minister, Jan O'Sullivan, and I happen to be in the same department as yourself, the number of houses that were built under your term as Housing Minister was very low indeed. And we know the reason for that was the economic conditions. And as things have improved, the housing numbers have gone up significantly. And I think that to balance the arguments that are being made, I think it's important that I make these points. But the core point here is the question of evictions. Do you know how many evictions there actually have been? Is there data on that? And an eviction, how do you define an eviction? You define it, I presume, as a notice to quit, is it? Or I'm not quite sure how you define that. But my own personal view, and I'm expressing a personal view, and I hold no property apart from the house that I live in, and I'm not a spokesperson for landlords anywhere. And I would stand up to the abuse, that landlords have given tenants in the past and helped them in that regard. But I do think that perhaps one way of dealing with this issue is to actually have a moratorium on evictions for a period of time. I think that all of the issues that you raised there are arguments for and against them, but I don't think there's any reason not to have a moratorium on evictions for a period of time, be it a year or 2 years. The point is that most people who are renting at the moment that I meet, they're waiting for their social house or their council house or their affordable home. They don't want to stay, forever in rented accommodation. And as the number of houses increase, And as the choices increase, rents will go down. I know it's not going to happen today or tomorrow, and people will get the home that they want. So I think we should look at that as a moratorium. I don't know the legislation that would be needed in relation to that. I think it would avoid a lot of the other pitfalls that may or may not be there if the Dáil were to pass that legislation. But if you were to say there would be no evictions, and I would put 3 conditions on that, I think it's important to say that the vast majority of tenants are good tenants, and the vast majority of landlords are good landlords. You know, and I wouldn't tar them all with the same brush. And looking at the case, obviously, where you have somebody that's paying their rent, if a tenant is paying the rent and doesn't owe arrears or substantial arrears, and if they're not involved in antisocial behaviour, and if the property that they occupy is in reasonable condition, I think they should have security of tenure, you know, for a period that would be defined by the Dáil, that they could not be evicted for a given period of time to be defined 2 or 3 years, whatever it might be. And I think that the landlord who's letting that property, his rights are being respected, his property is being paid for, it is being looked after, the tenant is a good tenant and is living reasonably and properly. And I would agree about the other point I'd like to make very strongly here, is that when I started off in public life, and I'd say it was a few years ago now, the average waiting list for a council house was about 2 to 3 years. Now in Drogheda it's coming near 10 years, you know, so there's huge insecurity in families. There's huge disadvantage when they have to move property to another location, and all of the disadvantage in terms of schools and friends and family come into play there. So I do agree that we need to significantly improve rights of tenants, but I believe you cannot say, and I don't presume that you argued that, you know, that if people don't pay the rent, if people are behaving antisocially, if they are destroying or damaging the property they're in, that they should have a right to remain there forever. I think that's hugely important. There would be absolute clarity on that. And I would not and never would stand over that, no more than I would stand over a bullying landlord who in the past would either switch off the electricity or harass the tenant or enter on the property without their consent or demand entrance without due notice and so on. So, but I think the middle ground is that we protect people, we give them increased rights, provided they're meeting their obligations as well. And I think I would ask, and I appreciate your latitude, Chairman, on this, that we would look at a moratorium, and I think that would give security of tenure until such time as the housing supply increases. But I think the other point that's been made strongly is that, you know, 86% of all landlords own not more than 2 properties. I think 70% of the 340,000 landlords own 1 property. So, like, I mean, that's the reality of the people out there that you're dealing with. And obviously, clearly, families get into difficulties. People who, and I know families, you know, where their parents became homeless as a result of, you know, I suppose decisions made during the boom. So I wouldn't exclude grandparents from your list in the Labour Party bill. I wouldn't exclude them. I think you intend to exclude them. I don't think that, if I've read you correctly, I don't think that would be right. And the last point is this, and I think the positive needs that are identified, but I don't know if they're in your legislation fully, is the question of increased long-term leases, encouraging landlords to lease for 20, 30 years, to give them tax incentives, to give them, you know, refurbishment grants and so on, and to get the best practice in other countries. And you mentioned Germany and other countries, and I think that if you can bring that to the table in terms of knowledge, that it would help the debate that, yes, because there will always be a private sector there, and we need the leases to be longer, we need the families to be more secure, and you need greater stability, you know, for tenants, and provided everybody is playing their full part and meeting their requirements, I don't see why the trust of what you want, and certainly what I want, is longer tenancies, more secure tenancies, no evictions for certainly for a given period, because if everybody, if we go back to say 20 years ago, when the supply met demand, there were no evictions, because people would say, well, I'm not happy with this landlord and I'm getting out and I'm going to such and such a place. So I think the point is, when supply increases, people will have a lot more choices. So I think protect them now with the moratorium. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks, Fergus. Deputy Barry, I know you have a question coming up, so I just have a couple of quick questions. You'll have a chance to come back in, and then I'll keep a record of any questions asked when you're gone, and so you can come back in. Just a couple of questions I have for you in relation to legal advice. And we have the library and research advice, and we'll seek advice from the OPLA if the committee agrees to that. What legal advice have both the witnesses received in putting this bill together? Because I have a couple of questions that I think are unconstitutional within, like some of what you're proposing I think is already incorporated in the government bill, but some I feel are unconstitutional. The refurb is grounds for an end to a tenancy. We did get reassurances from the department that there was clarification in what was a refurb of a property and what wasn't, and that's coming. And student accommodation will be included in the rent pressure zones. Where I have real issue is around the selling of property as grounds for terminating, and you want to sell with the tenant in situ. And I know this is a tricky one, but I believe that's unconstitutional. And I say that on the back of 86% of landlords in the market own 1 to 2 properties, and we have about 174,000 landlords. Some of them might be accidental landlords, or they might not. I don't know. But I think that just infringes on somebody's rights. Like Deputy O'Dowd said, they're paying their taxes, they're paying their local property tax, they're good landlords, they probably have good tenants. If they choose to sell their property for whatever reason, and it is a legitimate reason, I don't think that we can infringe unconstitutionally on their right to sell that with a tenant or without a tenant. They can sell it with a tenant if they decide to sell it with a tenant, that's their choice. I also have an issue around the compensation, that you want to give 6 months compensation on the termination of a tenancy, even when the termination is within the time period and is legally acceptable and all the rest. What made you come to that rationalisation? How do you quantify that? How do you propose to enforce that? Do you not feel that that will push landlords out of the market? I mean, it's a really fine balance to keep landlords and tenants, to give both of them security in this sector, to give both of them reassurances, to make it viable for not a commercial operator. I'm not talking about the big landlords that you always talk about. I'm talking about the people that own 1 or 2 properties, or up to, even maybe 3 or 4. That to make it financially viable for them to stay as landlords, do you not see that being it would just tip it over the edge? I just think 6 months compensation. I just want to know where the rationale came for that, and what legal advice that you did get or didn't get on that. I have a couple of other issues. I mean, according to the RTB, and they'll be in later, the main reasons for landlords serving notices in 2017, and they're a little bit different to the figures you gave, are the tenants were 44% of tenants were in rent arrears. Landlords intending to sell their property was 20%. Landlords intending to use the property for their own family was 8%. And landlords intended to substantially refurbish the property for 8%. And I'm always conscious of, using a hammer to crack a nut, where it's 8% of a problem. You want to actually go in really heavy-handed on this. And, the rental market is maturing over the years. We are coming off the back of a recession where we see social housing building is dramatically going up, and we need far more. We need the private sector. The private supply is coming up, and it will take a couple of years for that to steady off. But we can see the steady improvements that are happening and the supports that are there. And I always use the analogy of the builder's leveller. I think with some of these proposals that you have, whether I believe they're unconstitutional or not, and we'll have to get legal advice on that, I think the bubble will be outside the lines, and you're going to push landlords out of the market. And I don't think that's your intention, but I think that's what will happen. So I just would like to hear some responses, especially around the legal advice that you might have received in relation to those. So Deputy Barry, I'll come to you first because I know you have to be in the chamber.
Sure. Okay. So I'll reply first to your own questions, Chair, and then I'll reply briefly to some issues raised by Deputy O'Dowd. Right. So first of all, on the question of legal advice, we have taken legal advice. We have taken our own legal advice, and we are happy to have the bill tested against the legal opinion of anyone else, whether it be in this House or elsewhere. So,
you can share that legal advice.
Yeah, we can do that. Okay. So we would make a political point and then a legal point about this, right? The political point here is that you have a clash of interests, right? The interests of landlords and the interests of tenants. There is a clash of interests taking place. And you can assert the rights of private property and the rights of the market, but where has that led Irish society to? It's led us to the greatest housing and homelessness crisis in the history of the state. It's led us to a situation where there's a real possibility next week that the department will release figures which show that the numbers officially on the state's homelessness lists is over the 10,000 mark. Or I would assert the rights of society, and to say that society has the right to protect itself and those in rented accommodation from this situation by strengthening the rights of tenants, and this bill obviously aims to do so, in particular areas which are being cited day and daily, week in, week out, on notice to quit as grounds for evicting people, and in many cases evicting people into homelessness, such as sale of property and such as so-called renovictions. On a legal issue, the Constitution provides for the rights of private property. Right? The Constitution also provides for the state to take action in the interests of what the Constitution describes as the common good, and actually points towards that as being a very strong and in some cases overriding principle. Right? So our legal argumentation will be that the common good here overrides the rights of private property, and our opinion is that this is not unconstitutional and is a legally sound bill to put before the Oireachtas. Right? My own personal view is that if you were to have a situation where we were found to be wrong on that, and I don't think we are, that there would be a need for an urgent constitutional referendum in order to facilitate the implementation of the legislation, because the rights of society and the rights of the tenant should outweigh the rights of the market and private property in this instance. And the case for that is overwhelming, in my view, in the midst of a housing and homelessness crisis. So I'm happy to share in that regard. On the issue of 6 months compensation, the issue, what we're trying to do here, let me try and explain. Many tenants are being given notices to quit which state as reasons for eviction that a relative is going to move in. In some cases this is genuine.
It's 8%.
In many cases it's not genuine. Right? Now, by doing that, we would aim to flush out the landlords who are putting that forward as a false reason, as a reason that is not genuine. All right? We also think that 6 months compensation is not unreasonable, because if we look at the reality, you have, for example, a young family, family with children, finding alternative accommodation is very difficult finding alternative accommodation is very expensive. Right? So the inconvenience that that family is put to by being forced to move out in order to make way for a relative is worthy of compensation. Now, we can debate what level of compensation it should be. We feel that 6 months' rent is not unreasonable. And the principle of compensation for a tenant being asked to quit a premises is not an unheard of thing, for example, internationally. In the Netherlands, the state provides for compensation for tenants in a situation such as that and other circumstances. So we would argue that case. In relation to the questions that have been posed by Deputy O'Dowd, how many evictions? I think that if we look at the data that has been provided by Threshold, the RTB and Focus Ireland, we can get some sense of it, all right, if not a precise figure. Focus Ireland say that 69% of homeless families reported that their last stable home was in the private rented sector. We can imagine that the vast bulk of them didn't voluntarily evict themselves into homelessness, that there was a degree of...
They're not down as being evictions, we have to be very clear on that. So when we're doing a bill, it has to be based on stats and evidence. So I think Deputy O'Dowd was looking for a figure based on...
I think that we should, if you don't, and I'm not suggesting that you have all the answers here, but I think if we can get those facts, we can...
Yeah, well, I will provide you with further information. I'm not saying that 69% of homeless families have been evicted into homelessness. I'm saying that it is not an unreasonable supposition that a very significant number, or a majority, I would think,
people are evicted. There's no doubt about that.
So, to look at other data, in 2017, 32% of all queries to Threshold were about eviction notices. In other words, over 5,000 families or households contacted Threshold that year because they faced losing their home as a result of threatened eviction from the private rented sector. Right? This was up from 14% of all queries in 2016. And, you know, I don't think it's realistic to think that 100% of such cases came knocking on Threshold's door. That is a subset of the overall total in that regard. And similarly from the Residential Tenancy Board, their annual report for 2017 shows a massive 35% annual increase in disputes over invalid notices of termination from landlords. 41% of termination notices determined on by the RTB were found to be invalid, in other words, to be attempted illegal evictions. So, taken in the round, the Focus Ireland data, the Threshold data and the RTB data certainly shows that this is substantial.
How do you define eviction? That's the other question I have. What is? I'm not being rude. I'm just trying to be helpful here. I just to get, you know, what is an, if there's an agreement that your lease ends, right, and you have to leave. That's not. I'm not saying it's not. You have to leave the property. But is that? You see, I'm just looking at the terminology. That's why I think.
For me, an eviction is a situation where there is notice to quit given from a landlord to a tenant, and the tenant is asked to leave the property, and it's not voluntary from their point of view. They're going against their wishes.
So if they weren't paying rent, for instance?
Yeah,
I'm just trying to... It's more complex than black and white. That's the point I'd make to you.
The issue of a non-payment of rent or rent arrears is not dealt with in this bill. Right? We're dealing with the issue of issues such as sale of property and so-called rent evictions.
Yeah, but on that very point, if I'm not paying my rent, you know, I should be paying my rent. And if you're not paying your rent and have made no effort, reasonable effort to pay it, why should you be able to stay in the house if you're not paying your rent when you can?
I don't think that there's any reasonable person, Deputy, who would argue that someone who refuses to or does not pay their rent over a very long sustained period of time should have an automatic right to keep their tenancy.
They shouldn't have.
Shouldn't, but I would point out to you that the legislation, as I understand it at the state currently, is that someone who is in 1 week's arrear of rent can legally receive a notice to quit and be asked to leave within a period of 28 days. That would contrast with the position in Scotland, where someone has to be given 3 months' notice in a situation of arrears of rent. But that's a matter for another day. The bill does not deal with that issue specifically.
The point I want to get clear with you is that I don't. I think I've made it clear, and hopefully we agree that I certainly do not think anybody should be evicted from the home right now. And I think there should be a moratorium. And I think if that were the case, provided they're paying the rent, they're not antisocial tenants. Now that's another huge issue. I have people who are causing untold havoc in estates, private and public, by huge and very terrible antisocial behaviour, sometimes criminal behaviour, bound up with drugs, and also, I'm not saying there are many of these people, but when they're there, they really have an appalling negative impact. So what do you know? I mean, you have to acknowledge that.
I think Chair, I've probably missed my question in the House now, right? But
well, hold on a second. I'll come back if you want.
No, it's okay. I'll reply briefly, right? And the point I would make to you, Deputy, right,
sure,
is that this bill does not deal with the issue of eviction on grounds of antisocial behaviour, let alone eviction on grounds of criminal behaviour, right? The bill deals essentially with an important section of economic evictions, right? Evictions on grounds of sale of property, on grounds of renovation, the lack of protection for people in buy-to-lets and so on. Yeah. And I think those are the issues that we should focus on when we're discussing the bill, rather than discussing issues that are outside what this bill attempts to cover. I'm going to run.
So,
please don't leave.
So somebody being given a notice to quit, in a legal framework of time, you would still clarify that as an eviction if they don't want to leave the home?
Sorry, say again?
So somebody being given a notice to quit or terminate their tenancy, within the legal parameters, whether it be 3 months or 6 months of a notice to quit, and they don't want to leave that home, you would still say that that's an eviction?
I would regard that as an eviction, and I think that the law should be changed in order to afford tenants
even though it's within the legal parameters,
in a
you'd still say it's an eviction?
Yes, there are evictions that are legal as well.
Okay, thanks. Deputy O'Sullivan.
Yeah, well, first of all, I suppose in terms of the legal advice, the legal advisor to our party was supposed to be with me here today, but unfortunately couldn't be. So obviously he has.
You did offer it, to be fair, John.
Yeah, he has contributed to the bill, and with the background. But also, I suppose, in terms of legal advice, the Constitution hasn't, in this particular area, hasn't really been amended since 2004. So that all-party committee. The legal advisor to that all-party committee was Gerald Hogan, who would have been a very eminent constitutional lawyer. So I think we can rely on that as being the basis for the kind of balance that I'm trying to achieve in the bill. And just in terms of the term evictions, we don't actually use the term evictions in our bill. We're specifically talking about particular circumstances where people get notices of termination of tenancies. So rather than sort of have a blanket concept of eviction, we're dealing with specific areas in our bill. And if I can just maybe try and respond to the questions. In relation to that question about numbers, and the Deputy O'Dowd and yourself, Chair, as well, referred to around how many cases and so on how many people have to leave their homes for a variety of different reasons. I think it is hard to actually quantify, because obviously Threshold only know the cases that come to Threshold's attention. The RTB, by and large, would only know the cases that are taken for decision to the RTB. And similarly, Focus Ireland would only have, limited knowledge. So I don't know if we can actually, if anybody can actually supply accurate information on that. But certainly, if we can help in any way, in terms of the committee having that accurate information, we'd be happy to do so. Just again, the suggestion that somehow there should be a moratorium on evictions, I kind of get that, Deputy O'Dowd, but at the same time, I think that might be hard to implement, because how do you deal with the cases where somebody isn't paying their rent or is causing antisocial behaviour?
You can't, if somebody isn't reasonably paying their rent, and if they're antisocial, I think that.
But you would have to have a way of determining that.
Oh yeah, you'd have to have clarity in that.
You'd have to have a way of determining.
And you should be able to benchmark it into an RTB or somebody on that.
Yeah, but I suppose our approach then has been, instead of saying kind of, a generalisation, we're trying to pick out the individual reasons why people lose their homes and trying to present legislative measures that would actually give them security in their homes and also protect them from, undue rent hikes. And in that regard, just to say about the RPZs, I think they have had some success, I agree with you, in the areas where they apply, but they're not completely successful even in those areas, partly because there isn't a rent register, and therefore, if you're a new tenant, you don't know whether you're being charged more than the 4% or not. But I know that I do accept that the Minister has said that he's going to bring an amendment at committee stage in that regard, but I would make the point that I think that has to be dwelling specific, and that's the case that Threshold have made as well. In other words, it's not just the rent in a particular road, it's the specific rent for the specific property that you may be wanting to rent. The other issues, I think sale is the one, Chair, that you're particularly concerned about. And I suppose, again, I would argue that, in the case of the other European countries, they do have legislation that requires tenants to have the right to stay in situ in their homes. And the balance really is around, if you're going to have, expect people to live in long-term rental situations, which is a norm in many European countries, then you can't have a situation where they don't know when their property is going to be put up for sale and then they're out in the rear. So I think it is getting that balance. I do acknowledge that in Ireland we have a lot of accidental landlords, and in those situations they might well want to just get rid of the property completely, and the person who's likely to buy might not want to be a landlord, and I acknowledge that. But I think if we are ever going to sort of move our policy to have a situation where we have a private rented sector that is actually secure, then we do need to grasp that nettle of sale as a ground for termination of a tenancy. And that's why we have put it into the bill. So it's a matter of judgment. I would say that it's not unconstitutional. Others might argue that it is. But as far as I'm concerned, I think it does pass the constitutional test. But I do accept that other people will argue otherwise. So I don't think there were any. Somebody mentioned longer tenancies, and I think we all agree that we want to see, the Part 4 tenancies extended. Deputy O'Dowd made some general points, which I don't think I'd necessarily answer because they're not so much to do with the bill itself. But obviously I may agree with you some of them, I might not agree with you in others.
How many houses did you build, Chair, when you were Minister? That's
well,
the question. That's the question I'm asking you.
I could come back to you on that, and I could tell you that there are houses being opened now in my constituency that I actually approved when I was Minister.
But Jan, when you were Minister, I'm only being honest here.
No, but that just shows it takes 3 or 4 years for social houses to come on stream.
You can't come in here with a bucket of tears when you're Minister.
I've been in the situation where I've been the Minister who opened a housing development that a previous Minister had sanctioned. I think that's, we talk about how many houses are built this year, but actually...
What I'm trying to get at here, Jan, is not your excellent work as Minister, is the fact that what drove us to this was an economic cycle.
Absolutely.
Which you had nothing to do with.
Look, I think we all know that, we had a collapse of the economy.
But I think the point I want to make to you, is this, and I think it's an important point, is that I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying, but I think that we can't, and I don't think you're dumping on the system in the context of encouraging long-term letting of property, which is what we have to do, as well as building more homes by the state. And I think we must get the balance right, and I agree with you on that, and greater support for tenancies. But if there are less landlords in the business today than there were 3 years ago, and I think it's about 21,000 less homes available now than there were a year ago, there's something going wrong in the system when we need those homes to stay in the market. And I think that's the problem that we face.
If I can just finalise on that, we are in a situation where, we have a lot of people now in the private rented sector. We have a non-developed private rented sector, and we're all trying to grapple with ways in which we can protect tenants in that situation, who are in competition with each other, different kinds of tenants for a shortage of supply. And that's the ultimate problem, and I think that's what we're trying to tease out here in the committee, as to what you can actually do to protect tenants in that very precarious situation.
Thanks, Jan. Pat?
I'll be fairly brief, and I welcome Jan and her bill and indeed Mick's bill. And we have a bill in, and I think Sinn Féin have a bill in, and the government have their bill coming. So there's a fair emphasis to try and resolve this whole issue in relation to landlords and tenants. And I think, in fairness, we had a fairly productive meeting with the Minister here in private session only last week, and discussing proposed amendments that I think we're all prepared to put into that bill coming through the House. And it has to be, at the end of the day, of trying to find a balance between both the landlord and the tenants, and finding, a compromise position that facilitates both, because we need landlords and we need tenants, and we need to keep them both there, and as been identified here, and Jan, you've said it as well, the lack of detailed data that's available to us to make the correct decisions moving forward is actually disappointing. Like, RTB say they have 307,000 private rental tenancies registered with them. Like, what is the percentage that we're actually talking about here in relation to evictions? Do you know what I mean? That, and if we had that information in front of us, we probably could make more concrete, accurate decisions, because the last thing we want to do is have an impact on the market that further makes the whole situation worse. Like, the RPB are already telling us that 6,000 private rental tenancies exited the market last year. Now, we can't sustain that. While we're in the absence of the delivery of housing, we're depending on the rental market. Now, we can ask our question ourselves, like, as a society, where do we want to go? Do we want to move away from our traditional landlords that the country has always had? And you've pointed out, and everybody's pointed out, that 70% of the landlords in Ireland own less than one property, and 86% have 2 or 3 more. But we've only 14% commercial landlords, as we would consider them. And I think it is, from my analysis of the whole situation, I think it is a lot easier to bring legislation around the commercial landlords than it is about our traditional landlords, because there's a huge emotion attached to it, to every individual, and it's their property, and they feel entitled to do what they want to do with their one-off property that they've bought, whether it be as an investment or they were caught at the crash. Do you know what I mean? And they feel entitled to, as people have said, if I want to sell it, I should be entitled to sell it. Whereas that doesn't apply to the commercial landlord, because they're completely different. So as a society, I think, and as the rental sector is becoming more important, because more important people are deciding to rent moving forward, I think we need to make sure that whatever decisions we make here, and I would agree with a lot of what you're proposing, John, in your bill, that we do it, that it doesn't have an adverse impact on the market and further exacerbates the situation we're in. Like, in the whole area of deposit, I've no issue around that. I think we need to, and your issue in relation to the RPZs, I fully agree with you. I've said it from day one. It would have been easier to put the whole country in, and maybe have regulation on how you get out of it, as opposed to how you qualify, would have been one way of looking at it. Because in my own constituency, it's having a huge impact. Because I've one LEA that's hugely rural with a huge urban area in Blessington, right beside Tala, but it'll never qualify as an RPZ. And then I have another area, Arklow, sitting right beside Wicklow, Bray and Greystones, which are in it. And I know there's landlords abusing the system and shoving rents up because they're in fear that they will be in an RPZ moving forward. I don't have too much questions directly for you. I just feel that we need to be very careful in what we decide at the end of the day. Everybody's intention, I think, here in this room is to find the correct balance moving forward, both for the tenant and indeed for the landlord, because we do need to keep the 86% landlords there while we ramp up the delivery of social housing in the long term. That's all, Chair, at the moment.
Thanks, Pat. Jesse, who's substituting for Owen.
Yeah, thanks very much, and I just welcome both bills. And obviously there are some issues that we wouldn't necessarily be in agreement with, particularly in regards to the anti-evictions bill. But by and large, most of the recommendations are very solid and very sound. I have a few issues in terms of, we talk about the rent pressure zones, and we've sort of legalised this whole idea that you can have a 4% rise every 2 years. To me, that has been the wrong road to go down, for starters. People say it's working in areas, but we would have been better off, as Jan and others have said, linking this to the CPI, rather than going down this road. Because we are effectively saying to landlords that every 2 years you can get an increase of 4%. It doesn't matter about inflation, it doesn't matter about, you know, the cost of living. I just think that that's something we've got locked into by the government, and I think it's a mistake, and that's why I feel we should be pushing the issue of linking it to the CPI. Obviously the problem with the rent pressure zones is putting them across the whole country, because that's a major problem in terms of tackling it. That's why I don't think it's fit for purpose, and we should be concentrating in what I've said. The whole issue of, I know we've been saying about that we can't gauge, you know, how many people are being put out for the sale of houses, but I get it quite a lot in my office, and it is quite big, and that's what's so worrying, that people are being told we're going to sell the place, and more the intentions to sell is the big issue, and we then discover on occasions that it's not the case, that it's been, you know, the house has been refurbished and re-let on a thing. And the sanctions to come from the RTB against that don't seem to be fit for purpose in terms of dealing with that. So it is a major, major issue, and we need to. I think it's a good idea to try and get the definition of, you know, what's a family member, because it's quite often used. I do agree. I think we really need to look at that and also the issue of having a proper register. I think those things are very, very important. The refurbishing of properties. You know, I've heard it used a few times, and we do get it every now and again. I don't think there's a necessity on occasions to move the tenant out. I just think that some of these things can be worked around, or at least there could be an alternative put by the landlords if they're going to do this, you know. So I certainly think it's something that we have to look at. I had a few issues in terms of, we're also getting a situation where people who are on rent supplement or on RAS are being forced to go to HAP. And this is actually causing a major problem in terms of, this is adding to the homeless situation. People are finding themselves not able to do this, and this is common now. They're getting letters and they're told they have to do this, and people are coming in and they're panicking like mad, and some of them are actually ending up in homeless as a result of all this. I think that is something that needs. I know it is, but I'm just saying, because we're talking about people losing their homes, or, you know, that these letters are adding to the problem. I'm only making the point. I'm not things. The issue of the students' rights, I think that's a very, very important issue, because most of the students seem to be on licences as opposed to things, and I think we do need to tie the RTB into that more. I think that's an extremely important area. Another issue in terms of that's causing a problem is why we get a lot of people on rent. You know, I don't think anyone can turn around and say you can't evict someone over antisocial or, you know, very serious arrears or anything like that. I think we all accept that you know, someone just can't just plot themselves down and expect to get away with it. But what has happened in the past, the landlords, the money was paid directly to the tenants. That was a big, big mistake, and it still has happened. Whereas this should be either going to the landlord, the receiver, or to the bank. You know, we need to be careful how we do this, because I've seen it where people got money and literally they went off and spent it, unfortunately, and then we end up with massive big arrears, and it is a common thing to happen. So, by and large, I think there's merits. There's a lot of good things in both bills, and I think we will obviously be debating these as to whether, you know, some of the issues. I think Mick has some issues that I think we all have a little bit of a problem with in how we deal with them. So it's something we will debate over the next while. Okay, thank you.
Jennifer.
Thank you. And this bill is very important, and again, not to repeat, but going back to the rent pressure zones, and I see that you have down for a period of 3 years. I would actually say that should be 5 years, because I feel that there is at the moment a lot of counties in rent pressure zones when others aren't, and the ones that are not in it, like my own area, Carlow, and parts of Pat's area and other TDs and senators, they're far behind now. So I think to bring in this bill, we need to look at a 5-year period, because I think that's important, and maybe, Jan, you might look at that for me. The other thing is, and just going back to your Section 9 provides the rent register, and I know it's been brought up too, and which will be kind of identifying landlords and tenants. I think that's crucial, and I think why? Because I think the biggest issue here with bills, and I know everybody now, Fianna Fáil has a bill, Fine Gael, and they're all looking. I think all of us need to work together on this now, because this will be a crucial bill going forward for tenants and for landlords, because we have good landlords out there, we have good tenants, and it's getting the balance. And if we get the balance, then it will be right. But at the moment, if everyone's bills are so different, why can't everybody sit around the table together and put their bills in and get a really good, because this is about, you know, making sure that the tenant and their children are looked after, and also the landlord, because I know of a landlord recently who had bought his second house in the boom, and again, he was probably an accidental landlord, now has to sell his home to move into the other house because he has no choice. So there is genuine, you know, landlords too that do have really good reasons why they have to move, and then of course, you know, so there's always the balance. And I think if we don't get the balance here right in this bill, then it won't work. It will be unfit for purpose. And I also think, and I know this, it's something that we need to look at when this bill does go through, or whichever bills that we can kind of decide on. Enforcement. I think we can have as many bills on this as we want, but if it's not enforced, and local authorities, I believe, will have to play a massive part in this, because again, it's as you said, it's about the HAP, the RAS, it's about that. Like, local authorities will be the key to this, and I think it's the different agencies, whether it's the RTB board, whether, you know, whatever. Sometimes, you know, like, I think going to the local authorities and working through kind of some sort of a register, and we don't have that, and I think that will be the key aim here. But overall, look, I think it's a welcome bill. I think we need to all make sure we get the bill, and I think we need to get it out as soon as possible. I mean, 2004 is a long time since we've had something that we need to work on. So I'm all for getting this right, and I think all of us, no matter what party we are, we need to work to make sure that we do bring in some bill that will suit the tenants, and also, you know, that we get the balance for the landlords as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jan.
Thanks, Chair. Well, first of all, just on the data issue, you know, I think people are generally, we're all concerned that we don't have accurate data. Just when we got the submission from Threshold in relation to Minister Murphy's bill, they made a proposal which I think is worth considering, which was that they were suggesting that if a landlord issues a termination notice to a tenant for whatever reason, that they should be obliged to tell the Residential Tenancies Board. And that the Residential Tenancies Board then would tell the tenant, would advise the tenant of the fact that they exist and of their various rights. I think that's worth considering, because that would allow for earlier intervention. And I would also maybe suggest that the local authority then should be informed as well, on the point you made, Jennifer, that the local authority should be informed. Now, I think in Britain they have an obligation that you have to inform if there's a danger of people becoming homeless, that the local authority has an obligation to intervene in some way before they become homeless. So, you know, I think that's probably worth considering now. Probably, you know, maybe it will be considered in the context of Minister Murphy's bill as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that might be a way of ensuring, first of all, that there is data, and secondly, that the data is going to people who can actually do something about it. So, just
case, whether it's just rental supplement, HAP or otherwise, even private, is that what you're saying?
It's if there's a danger that somebody's going to lose.
Doesn't
their
matter
home for
whether it's private,
whatever
rented.
reason.
That's
yeah.
all I'm only asking.
Now, obviously, it's not in my bill, but I mean, it is something that's worth looking at, I think. On your point as well, Pat, about the rent pressure zones in your own constituency, I have exactly the same situation where you have an expensive urban area attached to a rural part of a local electoral area, and they're never going to get in. They're chasing the average the whole time. So, I mean, I think we're all agreed on that. And just on Deputy Ellis's point then, relating to, I suppose, the same issue, and the 4% being actually too much maybe in some situations. Yeah, I suppose one of the reasons why, and to go back to then Jennifer's point, Senator Murnan O'Connor's point about the 3 years versus the 5 years, I suppose one of the reasons why we put that in is because there's a previous provision that the rent increases would be linked to the Consumer Price Index. And I suppose there's a possibility that the Consumer Price Index could go higher than 4% within a time period. So it's a question of, do you review, at what point in time do you review, because in some cases it might be disadvantageous to the tenant.
I think, Jane,
if you don't review
the main part of that bill is to get them into the rent pressure zone.
Yeah,
the ones
exactly.
that are not in the rent pressure zone.
But there are issues around that. And currently, obviously, in the case of Deputy Ellis's point, the increases would be much lower if they were linked to the Consumer Price Index. They'd be lower than 4%. But it's to figure out what's going to happen into the future, which I suppose none of us can do. So then the issue around money to the tenant, I think that still happens with RAS, maybe not with RAS, certainly with rent supplement, but not with HAP.
With rent
HAP, it goes to the local authority.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, there's certainly a point there. And just finally then maybe to deal with the issue of enforcement, which again you made, Senator Murnan O'Connor, that is key, obviously. I mean, we didn't put it in our legislation. It's probably more about empowerment of the Residential Tenancies Board, etc. But I suppose it's true of anything. If you don't have good enforcement, then the legislation
it's not worth the paper
much use to people sometimes. So I hope I've kind of answered. Some of it was comment rather than questions on the bill.
Very good. Well done.
Okay, members, we're well behind time, so I'm going to propose, can I thank both our bill sponsors, Deputy John O'Sullivan, Deputy Mick Barry, and Jan, you're going to stay with us. Great.
I want to check the groupings in there because I think I might have an ordinary question.
So members, I propose we suspend the meeting for a few moments just to allow our witnesses to take their seats. So agreed? Thank you. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting, their mobile phones are switched off completely or turned to airplane safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones in silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting systems. Item number 7 on the agenda is detailed scrutiny of the Anti-Evictions Bill 2018 and the Residential Tenancies, Greater Security and Tenure and Rent Certainty Bill 2018. In our second session today, we will resume detailed scrutiny of both bills. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome from the Irish Property Owners Association, Margaret McCormack and Tom O'Brien, from the Union of Students, Ireland, Michelle Byrne and Megan Riley, and from Threshold, John Mark McCafferty and Anne-Marie O'Reilly. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172 of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence given to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I'd now like to call on Ms Margaret McCormack from the IPOA to make her opening statement.
Chairman, members of the Joint Committee on Housing, Planning and Local Government, thank you for the opportunity of speaking with you today. The Irish Property Owners Association, IPOA, was established in 1993 to represent property owners in the private rental sector. The IPOA encourages and educates its members on what constitutes good quality accommodation and professional standards of management. The association is a not-for-profit organisation and membership is not compulsory. Property owners who join the association are by definition responsible and use the association for education and advice to help them comply with the complex legislation governing the sector. The state has failed in its role to provide sufficient social housing for people who need accommodation. The private rental sector has provided homes for people where the state has failed and is a vital part of the housing market. 2/3 of tenancies in the Irish rental market are provided by property owners with less than 3 properties. 70% of landlords have 1 property and rely on same for their pension. The composition of the Irish market should be taken into account when drafting legislation. Investing is a choice, and changes proposed in the Anti-Eviction Bill and Greater Security and Rent Certainty Bill will further damage investment in the private rental sector and result in less accommodation available. Supply is the issue that needs to be addressed, and with this in mind, the state needs to incentivise investment in rental property rather than penalise same. A move to selling with tenant in situ will limit the selling market to investors, which together with the rent pressure zone restriction will substantially devalue a property. Investment value is based on yield, which will be driven off the restricted rent level. Investment value is based on yield, which will be driven off the restricted rent level in place on the property. Investors are less likely to purchase properties with restricted income. It makes more sense to purchase a property which has never been let, where market rent can be charged. Presentation of a property also affects the price, and an occupied property may not present well. The threat of withdrawing selling as a ground for termination has already resulted in some investors leaving the market. Indefinite tenancies are not workable. A 2-month probationary period is insufficient time to assess a tenancy. 6 months is more reasonable. The existing 6-year tenancy cycle allows for a no-fault method to get a property back. It is essential that this remains in legislation. 6 years is a long time and more than fair. The private rental market houses people from all walks of life, and often it is impossible to prove antisocial behaviour as a result of intimidation, or breach of obligation. A no-fault termination process is therefore essential. Property owners with good tenants want to keep them and are happy to renew after 6 years. Long leases can also be entered into, but the continual interference in the market makes this option unattractive. Substantial refurbishment is essential as a ground for termination. After a number of years of a tenancy, substantial refurbishment is required to modernise, to ensure it is up to date and suitable for the changing accommodation needs of the market. Substantial refurbishment is required to satisfy the needs of the market. State housing policy should not lead to the running down of accommodation. Substantial refurbishment, floorboards removed, dust created from sawing, rewiring, removing walls create an unsafe environment. It is essential from a health and safety issue and often an insurance issue that properties are vacant during the works. Restricting the deposit to 1 month's rent is inadequate. There may be substantial damage to a property in excess of the deposit and the rent may not be paid. The proposal is entirely inconsistent with the Residential Tenancies Act, which requires a minimum of 6 weeks to terminate for rent arrears and a minimum of 4 months to get a determination order. There is no recourse for property owners when the occupier has no income. A property owner must be free to decide how much deposit is required. Rent pressure zones over the whole country would be entirely inappropriate. No properties would be built in rental areas with low rent, as the return would not justify investment. It would drive landlords out of those areas, resulting in a severe shortage of rental property in rural areas. Including receivers in the definition of landlords is essential. The receiver collects the rent and should comply with the landlord's obligations in their entirety, including upgrading, repairs and refund of deposit. Including student-specific accommodation in the definition of landlords is impossible. The terms and conditions of licences are different. They do not have exclusive possession of the property. They are licensed individually and are only responsible for their own accommodation cost. They may not have a collective responsibility for the common parts of the accommodation. The Consumer Price Index would not function in the context of the rental market. The CPI does not reflect the significant costs associated with the provision of private rental accommodation, including taxation and increased labour costs like plumbers, electricians and painters. Placing the rent payable on a tenancy on the register is a fundamental breach of the data protection rights of the landlord and the tenant, and is in breach of the existing European-wide legislation. It may be the landlord's sole income, in which case their personal information is not protected under GDPR. The information is between the landlord and the tenant. On new tenancies, the landlord must provide the information to the tenant. The information is featured on the RTB registration. The RTB will be in a position to investigate where they are concerned that there may be a breach of the rent pressure zone regulations. Tenants in situ can request the information from the RTB if they believe they have been given incorrect information. In conclusion, the bills discussed today, if passed, will have a significant detrimental impact on the sector and will lead people with capital to invest their money in an alternative asset class. Chairman, Committee, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I now call on Michelle Byrne to make your opening statement, please.
Chair and Committee, thank you for having us today. I'm here on behalf of the Union of Students Ireland, who represent 374,000 students across the island, and we would like to clearly indicate the support of USI for the proposed bills, and would like to thank Deputy Mick Barry and Deputy John O'Sullivan for proposing them. I want to start off by giving a more general outlook to the current crisis the students are facing. On the night of the census in 2016, 8% of the total homeless that night were students. That's 429 students. When the government student accommodation strategy was launched in July 2017, there was an excess demand of purpose-built student accommodation of over 23,000 beds, and this is expected to increase to almost 26,000 beds this year. This means we are still 16,000 beds short, even if all purpose-built student accommodation projected is successfully built. And casting an eye over Dublin inner city today, you'll be forgiven for thinking that student accommodation seems to be built everywhere, surely to meet the need. However, there's been a 2% increase in student numbers every year for the past decade, and this is expected to continue for the next decade. Government have not built enough student accommodation to cover this increase, never mind addressing the shortage that currently exists. This, in effect, is a housing system buckling under the pressure, but in a very real way for students, it's becoming a significant barrier to education in itself. The context for students and their families is that, according to the DIT Student Life Survey, 12,500 is the estimated cost of living per annum while studying in third level, including fees of €3,000, which are the second highest fees in Europe. Grant rates were cut massively in budget 2012 and have not been adequately restored, in particular for postgraduate students. There's three main areas when it comes to purpose-built student accommodation that we're looking at, and it's cost, lack of affordability, rent pressure zones and lack of tenant rights. Much of the new student accommodation has been built is purpose-built student accommodation by Irish and global property investors, but the rents being charged are regularly unaffordable for the average student and is targeted predominantly, in our experience, at international fee-paying students who are generally fee-paying and more attractive for underfunded universities. Students in PBSA are treated as licensees and not tenants, so do not have the same rights. This is detrimental in many ways. A student signs a licensee agreement, not a contract. There's little legal protections for licensees. For example, they do not have to be registered with the RTB, there's no minimum standards, rent book regulations or minimum notice periods required. And PBSA, even in rent pressure zones, do not fall under the Planning and Development Housing and Residential Act 2016. So students are effectively in a legal limbo, and the anti-eviction bill will hopefully address some of these concerns. Last summer, we saw increases of up to 19% in one development in Galway that affected NUIG students and 27% in Dublin, which affected DCU students. Last month, again, we saw an increase of 10% in Cork in UCC student accommodation and 20% in another complex in Galway, presumably to prepare for legislation we were told we were getting last year in relation to rent pressure zones. The story is not getting better for students, and Megan is going to go and talk about that a little bit in a moment. I just want to kind of address our own research of the USI Student Housing Survey in 2017. We're currently doing another 2018 one, and this is the most up-to-date data we have. So over 1 in 5 respondents to our 2017 survey experienced unexpected increase in rent before or shortly after moving into or outside of the allowed agreed period. A quarter of all respondents had a dispute with their accommodation provider, out of which the majority were in purpose-built student accommodation and privately rented student accommodation. And 17% of those experienced conflict sought professional help. So most frequently, these students are looking for assistance to turn to their students' union or to Threshold. So the real impact on students is students are dropping out of college because of these costs, they're staying in the library and then couch surfing with a friend, and they're commuting hours to get to lectures, and this is directly affecting students' abilities to get a decent education. The system is perpetuating and indeed worsening educational inequality, because students of many families are considering going to college will not end up pursuing their first choice in places like Cork, Dublin and Galway because of the cost of accommodation in urban areas. And in effect, this is reducing the social capital of upcoming generations. To address the bills in question, in relation to the anti-eviction bill, extending the tenancy rights of students in purpose-built student accommodation is a vital change that's needed in the current housing policy. Students have little to no rights in PBSA, and students are licensees, not tenants, and currently this bill does address this. PBSA does not have to register with the RTB, and this has left many students confused as if they can take a case or if they have any rights at all. And at a time where students are desperate for a roof over their heads, they're being exploited, and we need to ensure we do whatever we can to amend that. The second bill, the Residential Tenancy Greater Security of Tenure and Rent Certainty, addresses key problems for students too, including but not limited to deposits exceeding 1 month rent and a residential tenancies register, due to the nature of students staying in accommodation for approximately 9 months, or due to the nature of the way that the purpose-built student accommodations produce the rent or the amounts that they have paid before, and this is not clear, and this would really help clear up more of this problem. And Megan is actually going to speak more about this in a real sense from Galway.
Thanks, Michelle. So just to speak a little bit to our experience in NUI Galway, we have a student population of over 18,000, and our students have been very badly affected by issues particularly around rent certainty and security of tenure. These bills address some of the issues that students have been facing, but really just scratch the surface of what is going on. So last year in NUI Galway, student residents associated with but not owned by the university increased their rents by 19% overnight. In the Students' Union, we came out strongly against the increase as well as protesting. We took a case against the accommodation provider with the Residential Tenancies Board. This is how we learned about the 4% rent pressure zones not being extended to PBSA, and the difficulties with residents in PBSA being classified as licensees instead of tenants. And as a consequence of that, the lack of rights that are afforded to students. In our case, even though it was titled a licence agreement, the adjudication treated it as a tenancy. However, we have learned from Threshold that a similar case in Cork was treated as a licensee agreement, showing a lack of clarity around how these cases are treated, and the anti-eviction bill goes a ways towards clearing this up. This, unfortunately, our case failed on a technicality, but it was then that we started to lobby for rent caps to be extended to PBSA. Almost a year later currently, and rent caps still haven't been extended to PBSA, and we're faced with another increase of €1,400 in another one of our student villages, which is a 20% increase. This came again overnight, and it was brought to us by a student who is now looking at taking a year out to afford her final year in college. She has 2 working parents and just misses out on the threshold to receive the grant. She is currently working 25 hours a week to keep herself in college. These unprecedented rent increases we have seen also come with extortionate deposits, often 2 months' rent or upwards to be paid up front, which is why we welcome the addition of a limit of a deposit of 1 month's rent in the Greater Security of Tenure and Rent Certainty Bill. A residential tenancies register is also a welcome change, as quite frequently we ourselves in students' unions are left trying to gather data for what has been happening year on year, and currently PBSAs don't have to disclose what previous rents were, so we are very much reliant on students bringing forward information on increases. The issues that we're dealing with in Galway are happening also in Dublin and Cork and spilling out of cities across the whole country. Students are frustrated, but it is so much more than that. It's affecting their access to education and their successes even within that system. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I'd then like to call on John Mark McCafferty and Anne-Marie O'Reilly.
Chair, members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. We welcome the opportunity to present to the committee on the Residential Tenancies Greater Security of Tenure and Rent Certainty Bill 2018 and the Anti-Evictions Bill 2018. Threshold has advocated for increased security of tenure, affordability, improvement in standards and for a sustainable private rented sector since its foundation by Father Donal O'Mahony in 1978. We are working toward a vision whereby private rental is on an equal tenure status as other tenure options in Ireland, and the 2 bills we are here to discuss today tackle many of the very issues and seek to improve the rental sector for those who have made their homes in it and for those who will make their homes there in the future. Both bills seek to include lending or financial institutions in the definition of landlord. The Greater Security of Tenure Bill goes further to include receivers in the definition. As this committee is aware, Threshold has long called for the recognition of banks and receivers as landlords in the case of repossession of homes subject to buy-to-let mortgages. It is essential that both banks and receivers are recognised as landlords to ensure tenants' rights are respected in the case of repossession or the appointment of a receiver. The establishment of such security is essential if private rental is to exist as a legitimate tenure alternative to owner occupation and social housing. We welcome the proposal to include licences for student accommodation in the definition of tenancies and licensees in student accommodation in the definition of tenants. It is our position that all licences and licensees, and not exclusively those living in student accommodation, should be added to the definitions of tenant and tenancy. It will be of no great surprise to the committee that Threshold supports the proposed definition of a deposit as it is outlined in the Greater Security of Tenures Bill. At this time of increasing unaffordability, where tenants are being asked for the equivalent of 2 months' rent as a deposit in addition to their first month's rent to secure a home, a legal definition is vital to ensure tenants can afford to access the private rented sector. We have called for this definition for some time and for it to work alongside a dwelling-specific rent register, which is essential for the protection of tenants and, indeed, the enforcement of the RPZ rules. Now, linking rent increases to the CPI linking rent increases to the CPI will link rents to a tangible measure and reflective of supply and demand. And we are in favour of the proposed amendment. We propose, however, that increase be subject to an overall limit of 20% increase over the course of 5 years. In addition, we are in support of the proposal to designate the state as a rent pressure zone. We recommend that the designation be extended beyond the 3 years, as Dublin and Cork will cease to be RPZ areas in December of this year, followed by the remaining areas in 2020. And again, the enforcement of such measures is absolutely key, assisted also by the dwelling-specific rent register that I mentioned. We see merit in extending Part 4 rights to tenants once they have been in occupation for 2 months. In addition to this, we fully support the creation of an indefinite tenancy through the removal of Section 34B, which has been a long-standing position of threshold. This is an essential step in making the private rented sector a viable, sustainable tenure choice. Sale as grounds for termination has no place in a modern rental sector. This has been the #1 reason for tenants to contact Threshold in 2016, 17 and 18. Continuing to permit sale as a grounds for termination prevents the establishment of a sustainable private rented sector and undercuts the effectiveness of HAP as a social housing support. We support the proposed removal of sale as a grounds of termination, as proposed in both bills. Threshold is in support of the extension of notice periods for tenants, particularly those who have been in occupation for less than 6 months, and for long-term residents who may have lived in a home for a substantial period of their life and are possibly at a later stage in life. If renting is to become a tenure of choice, and given that an increasing number of people are renting into older age, 1 year or more is not an unreasonable notice period. Again, the committee may well be aware of our view on this matter. Threshold has long called for the creation of a publicly available rent register. It's essential that it be dwelling specific, allowing a tenant or prospective tenant to determine the rent on the property prior to them moving in. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Barry.
Thank you, Chair. I have questions that I would like to direct towards the representatives of the Union of Students in Ireland, and questions that I would like to direct towards the Irish Property Owners Association. So first, for the USI, I'm going to be a bit parochial on this one. Right? You made a couple of mentions of events in Cork, and I'm just wondering if you might come back in and restate them, because I'm not sure if I quite caught one, and the other one I would like more information on, if that was possible. Right? First of all, you mentioned something about UCC and a 10% increase. Could you just clarify as to what you were talking about there? And second of all, you mentioned that you mentioned in relation to the RTB challenge that was mounted in Galway, and then you said that there had been a similar challenge in Cork, where you had a ruling that someone was a licensee. Could you give the committee more information and detail about that particular case? I'm interested to hear that. So my questions for the Irish Property Owners Association. Yeah, your paper talks about, I'm quoting here, the threat of withdrawing selling as a ground for termination has already resulted in some investors leaving the market, right? Now, I just note the fact that you regard protection for tenants on grounds of sale of property, which is the legal position in Germany, Sweden, Denmark and the Netherlands, as a threat. But I'm wondering if you could indicate to the committee the evidence, which you obviously have, about investors leaving the market because of the possibility of sale of property being taken away as grounds for termination. First of all, I'm a bit surprised by that, because I don't think, I mean, I'm very hopeful for the anti-eviction bill, and I'm going to push it as hard as I can in the houses of the Oireachtas, and I hope that the emerging housing protest movement pushes hard for this bill as well. But I don't think anyone would say that selling as grounds for termination being removed is on the verge of happening here. And I'm surprised that there's talk about investors leaving the market because of the threat of it. Can you quantify that? I mean, are there many people? And can you give an idea of the type of numbers that you're talking about there? And having mentioned Germany, Sweden, Denmark and the Netherlands, I'd like to ask you as to whether the IPOA has examined the position that pertains within those jurisdictions. You know, I mean, it's the law of the land in those countries that you don't have the right to sell a property and evict a tenant on those grounds. The tenant must be kept in situ. I don't see that it's caused an enormous upheaval or anything in any of those countries. It seems to have become the law of the land and work reasonably well. Maybe you might comment in relation to the position that exists in those countries. And then finally on the issue of, I'll just find it here, if the bills discussed today, if passed, would have a significant detrimental impact on the sector and will lead people with capital to invest their money in an alternative asset class. Just a point that often comes up in the committee here is that 70% of landlords own one property, 87% own, I think, one or two properties. You know, can you see any circumstance where if you were to give the tenant the right to remain in the case of sale or in the case of renovation, that you would have people in that category leaving the market? I mean, to what end? I don't see, you know, what one might do other than sell the property. If you remain the owner of the property, surely it's better to have a tenant in the property than it is to leave it lie idle. I don't think doesn't seem to me that the idea of a massive flight of investment is really on the cards, but maybe you've got some information that would contradict that. I'd be interested to hear it, although it does underline once again the importance of the state intervening and providing social housing on a significant scale so as people have a real option in that regard. So they're my questions.
Thanks, Mick. I'm going to take Pat. I'm going to take two at a time. Pat?
Oh, yeah, thank you. And just as I previously stated in the last session in relation to this, it's very important that we get the balance right in this whole sector and we don't end up with unintended consequences. Just maybe just a few specific questions to the Irish Property Owners Association. And I will put on the record, I'm fully aware there's an incredible amount of good landlords out there and good tenants, and we all know that we've bad landlords and indeed we've bad tenants, and that's why we need to make sure we have a balance. Just in relation to the deposit, you know, your statement is clearly saying that it should be your right to determine what level of deposit a person should pay, but does that not, but extrapolating from that, that could lead to you choosing the people who qualify for private rental accommodation and exclude people who just cannot afford more than 1 month's rent. And do you think that is fair in society today? And in relation to the refurbishment, do you have in your own idea a definition of what is substantial refurbishment in relation to that? And my own view on the rent pressure zones is really, and I would agree with what has been said here, my own point is, and I gave the example in the last session, is I felt the whole country should have been in the rental pressure zone, and the criteria should have been around how to exit a rental pressure zone rather than how to get into it, and maybe we wouldn't have the inconsistencies that we're having around the country in relation to that. And you're showing huge reservations, or property owners, in relation to the data register. I mean, what are the fears about that? Because we all, I think, believe at this stage that it's important that we get down to that detail level so that we can, control this moving forward. Just in relation to threshold, as we've spoken before, 86% of the market is controlled by small landowners who are not commercial landowners, and only 14% are commercial landowners. And I think we all could give you examples of people who bought an apartment in the boom times, have married, have their family, have moved out, and are renting their own property while they're trying to get rent. And they're getting to the stage where they just need to offload it to be able to move on with their lives. So is the question in relation to Ireland, is the question that we should be focusing in getting a greater percentage of commercial landlords into the marketplace? Are they easier to manage and control moving forward? And is that the direction that we should be, as a state, moving into? And just in relation to the student union, I'd like to welcome Michelle back here again. She was with us in November, a constituent of mine from Dunlavin. We equally, I suppose, and Darragh introduced our own bill last year, which specifically deals with your concerns, which was the residential rent pressure zone and student accommodation amendment bill 2018. And that bill gave a clear definition of what student accommodation was and put you clearly into the picture of the rental pressure zones. And would you feel that that bill would help control the majority of the issues that you've raised here today? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Pat. I'm going just to remind, you were asked a question there about a case, Michelle, and I'm just going to remind you, because we're used to it in here, that persons or entities cannot be named or identified in here, so they're protected by privilege. So just to remind you of that, not to name any people, if that's okay. I'm going to come to you first to respond to Mick and Pat.
Okay to name the name of a complex, or?
Yeah, that's okay, just not individuals.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for your question, Deputy Barry. In relation to the UCC case, it's actually campus-owned accommodation. The rent did not go up last year, but it has jumped 10% since in this year coming. The Students' Union have made a number of representations in order for that to be lowered, because the 10% jump year on year is too much. Now, we can see this as a reaction to potentially the rent pressure zone legislations that are coming through, hopefully in the next year, that people are hiking up rents now that they see that the RPZs might actually cover these purpose-built student accommodation blocks, or we could see it as a result of an underfunded education system and colleges trying to bring in more income. But look, that's a kind of a conversation for a different committee, but it could be the outcome for both of those. And I suppose the second part of your question, I'll let Megan address that from Galway.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, thanks for the question. Just to come in specifically, I suppose, about, I think it was a reference to the case that I had made a brief mention to in Cork, and as well the one in Galway. So there were actually, I don't have the details of the case to hand, but there were two separate cases in Cork, and one was found to be a licensee and another was found to be a tenancy. The one that we took forward ourselves, like I said, it failed on a technicality because the person actually wasn't a sitting tenant. But I suppose that the purpose of bringing it forward was to challenge this increase. And essentially what we were saying was that it might be titled a licence agreement, but it had all the characteristics of a tenancy and of a tenancy agreement. And essentially that was agreed within the hearing that we brought forward. It was just that the case essentially couldn't succeed on technicality.
If, for example, a section of the media wanted to find out more about the case in Cork, who would you suggest that they would contact?
We have the details of those cases. They're from a couple of years ago, the ones in Cork, but we're seeing now that we're still facing the same problems a couple of years on. But if anyone would like further details of that, we can send them that. That's no problem.
Thank you. I'll address Deputy Barry's questions in the first instance, because I suppose your questions and indeed the bill that you're putting forward demonstrate a certain ignorance of the sector, which I think I'd welcome the opportunity to put some facts around the matter now. I suppose your bill is the latest in a series of, I suppose, misguided and really populist-driven measures that are really interfering in the residential rental market and probably hurting some of the people that you espouse to represent because of the impact of your policies and pronouncements on the sector. You've been here, I'd say, at this stage 2 hours this morning, debating the bill. And I wonder, have you mentioned supply once in those 2 hours? Because really, you've asked questions of us and you've asked for anecdotal evidence in relation to the sector, and really, if you were attuned to the sector and if you were following what's going on in the sector, you'd be well aware of what the supply issues are. So just some stats, which are not my stats, these are publicly available stats coming from the various DAFT reports, which I took the time out to look at last night, and I went back as far as the DAFT quarterly bulletin that was issued in December 2012. And nationwide at that point in time, there was over 8,500 properties available in the country to rent. And if you follow the graph through the same period in 12, 13, 14, 15, that stock continually declined up until December 17, when it hit a low of 3,250. Rolled it on to December 2018, and we're now at 2,800. So it's clear here that we have a supply issue. One of the leading estate agents in the country, and probably the most respected in terms of research that it conducts on the sector, being Sherry Fitzgerald, has categorically stated that less than 40% of rental properties that are put on the market are acquired subsequently by investors. So if you have 10 buy-to-let properties brought to the market, about four of those properties are coming back into the rental market. So there's a rapid decline and a deterioration in stock. And that's not just because people have all of a sudden decided that the rental market is something that is unattractive. Really what they've decided is they've looked at the tax cuts and the tax provisions and legislative changes that have happened since 2009, and they've said, you know what, there's easier ways of making money. I can put my money elsewhere. I won't be subject to legal risk. I won't be subject to tenant risk. I won't be subject to funding risk, and I can make the same return more elsewhere. So really, in looking at legislation, I think you must be guided by the supply issue. All of the provisions that have came and have been directed at the rental sector in the last 10 years have all been anti-landlord driven. They've all been anti-investment driven, in circumstances where we have population growth every year on year, of a minimum of 0.5% every year. So we've had 200,000 additional people residing in the country since 2013. So supply is the issue. So if Deputy Barry and Deputy O'Sullivan were doing their jobs and were actually interested in addressing the supply issue that we have at the moment, what you would have been doing was bringing legislation and a bill through the Dáil which saw tax incentives and incentivisation for people to invest in property, sought an easing of the administrative and legislation burden that is on landlords, because you'd be interested in bringing more properties to the market, which would and has been proven to reduce rent. So if we look at the situation throughout the recession, when there was a surplus of property available, rent halved. So the only way of resolving the rental issue is by bringing more supply. And in circumstances, I have to say, it's at its best, it's incredulous. If you took a neutral position, it's misguided. But if it wasn't so serious, it'd be funny. So bringing more legislation down the line that's going to drive further investors out of the market, I just think it's mind-boggling. There's constitutional issues in terms of people's property rights that are relevant to your proposals. There are serious GDPR issues relevant to a tenancy register, which I think Deputy Casey has mentioned. And the best legal minds in this country won't be able to figure out a way of protecting both a property owner and tenant's details without breaching what is EU-wide legislation in relation to data protection. So there's a couple of hurdles there to jump, I think, at this point in time. But if I can just address the specific issue in relation to how do we know that investors are selling. We took soundings from an investor which was in Deputy Elsa's constituency this week. And just for the record, and you'll probably be aware of this, there's 30 properties on the market in Dublin 9. I know you represent Dublin 9 and Dublin 11, but Dublin 9, there is 30 properties for rent on the market as of this morning. We had an investor who was renting a 2-bed apartment in that area, and he took notes of, he got 72 calls in relation to that property. And of the 72 calls, north of 50 of the people that were looking for accommodation were looking for accommodation on the back of their landlord selling up. So if you want more relevant data and more up-to-date data in relation to are people selling up, yes, they are, and it's entirely obvious. And if Deputy Barry was involved in the business, which he's clearly not, he'd be well aware that that is real and that's happening.
A member of the committee.
No, I'm not making charges, but some of the questions lead yourself to that conclusion. But some of the questions are so basic in substance that, you know, there's no other way of addressing them. So I suppose we don't need to prove stats, and to some degree, I mean, you guys need us more than we need you, to some degree. So we're not trying to sell a concept here. There's a severe shortage of accommodation in the market. All of your measures are anti-supply. There is no taxation basis. There's no business case for investing in buy-to-let property at the moment. You pay 55% tax. You pay funding costs of 6%. You've got management charges. You've got local property taxes. You have taxation that is not treated on a consistent basis with other industries. And to be quite honest, the supply issue is going to, if we're sitting here in a year's time, you will see the 2,800 properties that are available nationally, I suspect will be down closer to 2,000. So what would have been a welcome development both by Deputy O'Sullivan and Deputy Barry was if a measure had been brought forward to incentivise people to get into the market. I don't see too many people talking about capital allowance schemes in areas of high demand. I don't see... Yeah.
You asked a lot of questions that we need to be able
to
answer as well,
absolutely.
Tom, to be fair.
But these are questions that the market, that the House should have been addressed to the House and should have been raised in public. Rather than having sound bites and policy by populism, we should have people that are trying to make a real difference in the sector, trying to bring accommodation to the market at affordable prices. And to be quite honest, there's nothing in what we've seen here that will do anything to improve the supply issue. And we will be grappling with supply, with high rents, with a lack of accommodation. The first thing that my colleague from the Students' Union mentioned was that there is a shortage of accommodation. Everybody that you talk to, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, accept there's a shortage of accommodation. And none of the legislators on this side of the room have brought any measures forward. What you're looking at is protecting the existing level of stock. The existing level of stock has been proven to be inadequate. It is inadequate because we wouldn't have a supply issue if it wasn't.
Outside of this bill, Tom, just to be clear, there's a lot of measures coming forward from this committee to increase supply and to encourage supply that you might not be privy, you might not have seen.
They're going on for some time.
But just to say, not to make charges against any members, members aren't allowed to make any charges against any witnesses.
No.
I'm in the chair, I have to remain impartial. I just don't want anything coming back at anybody in this room, so I just have to...
There's no charges, but how do we address what's in front of us without making these points?
Yeah, no, I agree. Look, I'm not in favour of the bill, so but I'm trying to be impartial as chair
here. If we're
here.
asked to address what's in the bill, how do we do that, unfortunately, without pointing out some of the obvious issues that are inherent in it? Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
So, if I can just finish, I mean, there was a reference made to other countries, and you're right, you've cherry-picked a couple of countries there that align or are consistent with your paper. But I noticed the most obvious country that you didn't mention, that is culturally and economically and systemically consistent with Ireland, is the UK. And I noticed you conveniently left out the UK. And have you got a view on what the UK position is in relation to your measures? Do you know what the UK position is in relation to eviction where rent isn't paid? Do you know what the UK position is in relation to deposit protection? So this is clearly an example, you know, what we've had all of policy over the last number of years. What happens is you cherry pick the countries that suit your argument best, and you pick a little bit out of the UK system, you pick a little bit out of the German system, a little bit out of the Amsterdam system. What you get is a collection of very poor and misguided policy. And I might sound frustrated, and the reason I sound frustrated is because we are frustrated. We've been in before this House on a number of occasions, and it really is, we feel, a box-ticking exercise. Our views are not listened to, and I suppose what the output of that is you are where you find yourselves now at this point in time, with a lack of supply. And what you're trying to do at the moment, or what the aim of this here, this unintended, as you mentioned earlier, unintended consequence from this bill, is that the existing stock you have will be further undermined and further reduced, and we'll be 2 or 3 years down the line and we'll be no further on with addressing the housing shortage. I'm not sure, Deputy Casey mentioned a couple of things there around deposits and whether they're fair. So a 2-month deposit, is that fair? I suppose a landlord being left with no rent for the last 3 months, damages to his property, and not having a deposit to compensate him, is that fair? You know, the thing has to be fair both ways. Refurbishment, I mean, we're mute on refurbishment. We think that if you do substantial refurbishment, you should be able to get a return on that investment. Why would anybody invest money in refurbishing a property that meets the minimum standards if they cannot increase their rent? So I think what the unintended consequence you're going to have on the refurbishment front is that you will, in 3 or 4 years' time, have a very tired supply of stock. You'll have people that are looking to relocate to quality stock, people coming and joining the Facebooks and Googles of this world, they'll be coming with a certain expectation of accommodation, and unfortunately this country won't be able to provide that, because the legislation that surrounds refurbishment in the rental sector will be one that doesn't provide or doesn't allow landlords to refurbish. The RPZs, again, I don't think I need to say anything about my views on RPZs and the data register or the tenancy register. I really don't know how that in any way will comply with the GDPR legislation, which is not something that you guys can deal with locally here. It's an EU law. So, yeah.
On that very thing.
I'm going to bring you in, Darragh, but I have to bring John Mark Cafferty in first.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just in terms of that question in relation to the smaller landlords, Deputy. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a balance that's got to be struck, and it's a delicate balance. And from the point of view of the people that we assist and we work with and we advise, the vast majority of them are being housed by small landlords. So we don't take the things that we're thinking about and saying lightly, because we are mindful of that balance. In terms of the larger institutional investors, there's a place for them. They have grown. I guess I've been working in this area for a number of years and had hoped that the larger institutional investors would be one of the larger kind of sources of supply for private rented tenants. However, they are essentially interested in the higher end, if you like, the higher income renter. And so what we require then, as well as attempting to maintain what we have, is affordable rental. So we need a supply which is provided by a number of players, including housing bodies, approved housing bodies, which provides rental at a kind of an affordable level, but is also, I guess, financially sustainable for the providers themselves. And there could be a range of providers that may be able to offer this. And I know this is something which has been kind of debated and discussed at government level for some time. It would be great to see a number of these kind of coming on stream and kind of building up in terms of volume. Just in terms of, I guess, some of the comments there. I mean, we talk about a dwelling-specific rent register. There is already a property sale index, which is specific to the dwellings that are sold, so there's already a precedent there. And just in terms of, we've mentioned sale as a grounds for eviction. Actually, I mean, right now in the context of Brexit, England isn't my favourite country right now, but England actually is a place where sale is not permitted as a grounds to evict. It's a common law jurisdiction, likewise to the Republic of Ireland. But even in a place with such kind of ambivalent policies towards renters, they have that as a rule. So, thanks.
I'll bring you back in on the next round. Is that okay?
Just very quickly, just
sure.
One question there. The reason that in the UK that sale is not required, or that a vacant possession or removal of tenants is not required to sell, is because there is provisions there that you can remove your tenant within a prescribed period of time, that you don't need that particular provision. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that you can make that point, because you can get vacant possession much easier in the UK, which allows you to sell on that basis.
Thanks, Tom. Desi, Mick, I'll bring you back in once everybody's had a go.
Thanks very much, everyone there, for their contributions. I just I sort of felt a bit frustrated, like Tom, in many ways, but I felt that in another way that you sort of looked on everyone here as an enemy, and that a lot of these bills were designed to attack the Irish property owners and people renting. I don't see it that way. I see it in a way. I don't necessarily agree with everything that's in these bills. I think I'd have some problems in a number of areas, but I see it as we're trying to get a proper functioning system, whether it's social housing, whether it's private housing, whether it's people renting or otherwise. That's what we're trying to do, trying to get it into a particular perspective. The issue of supply has been constantly raised in the House and at different committee meetings. We've constantly been arguing that supply and the methods and the policies that are being pursued are not giving us enough supply. And that is the key in many ways to keeping the rental market at a certain level. But I would say, you gave me an example of Dublin 9. The average price in Dublin 9 now to rent an average house is 1,800 to nearly close to 2,000. That's the reality of what we have in Dublin 9. And no one, including yourself, could not tell me that that's justifiable. You know, so we have to look and then see. I am getting it constantly. And I know loads of landlords, and no one, I'm not for 1 minute anti-landlord, because I certainly know a lot of decent landlords, but no one can turn around and say that we haven't got a problem with people being put out of their homes or for the sake of sale. And that is constantly coming into my own constituency office, where there's a lot of landlords saying they're going to sell. And some of them are genuine, and some of them are not. And we all know that. So we have to get a balance in how we deal with all this. And I think that's very important. You mentioned about substantial refurbishing. If there's a case there and it's properly laid out, that's, you know, it has to be, in my opinion, very substantial refurbishments, because to put someone out or to tell someone we have to terminate or we have to, you know, if it's possible for the landlord to put them somewhere else, fine, but that doesn't always be the case. But if there is a genuine argument there, I think that obviously that has to be looked at. The deposit issue, I think it's very difficult for a lot of people in the private sector, especially. We've had it where people have gone to the welfare officers and they've got a deposit from the welfare officers, and that in some cases worked. I think nobody's. It's something I have experienced where landlords have had issues where people haven't been paying for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, actually even longer, and not paying or not receiving rent payments, and that to me is not acceptable either, you know, and that has to be addressed. Just in regards to the student accommodation, I do think that the whole area needs to be strengthened up in terms of, you know, what the students can do. They should be able to go to the RTB. They should have that facility that they can deal with the RTB. I don't accept the argument that that you were making in terms of, that was being made by Tom, that they're a different situation. You can't sort of, you know, you can't tie them into rent pressure zones, or you can't. In my opinion, rent pressure zones, I've said this earlier, and I've said this for a long, long time. I disagree with the whole concept. I prefer that we were tied to the CPI, the consumer price index, and that's across the board. Where we have rent pressure zones in one area, we haven't got it across the country. To me, it's setting the likes of, say, for instance, in Dublin at the moment, you have 4%, and every 2 years you can just put on 4%. I just don't buy that argument. I think it's wrong. Now, it can work. Sometimes it can work against you if you're tied to the CPI. If the inflation goes up, obviously it can affect you. But by and large, it's a fairer system, and I just feel that's thing. The amount of investors leaving the market, I don't think, we look at the housing lists and all the measures that have been put in place, we're not making any dent. We still have a massive homeless situation. what we don't seem to be realising that the population is growing. The demand is even growing. So, and the amount of stock is lessening in the private sector. So we come back to the same story. We must be building more. We must create more supply, and that is so important. But we shouldn't underestimate that thing. In terms of antisocial and people with huge arrears, I mean, obviously you can't have antisocial. The council have a policy of moving against people in antisocial. The same situation should apply in the private sector, that they should be able to, in a case of very serious antisocial or massive arrears, there has to be a mechanism to deal with that, and I don't think anyone disputes that. Okay, it's just some points.
Next, Darragh.
Thanks, Chair. And just, I know, Chair, we had priority questions on housing in the House at the same time, so I did read the opening statements and I've been watching them. So apologies for not actually being here when you made your opening statements, but I've read them. I had questions to Minister Murphy at the same time. As I said, I suppose just one thing, and you'll know this anyway, but the purpose of as housing spokesperson from Fianna Fáil, that I facilitated this bill to come in to committee by abstaining for the very reason of allowing people to put their views forward, whether they agreed with Mick's bill or not. And there's a large portion of Mick's bill that I don't agree with, actually, and I don't think are workable. So I sense the frustration, and I get that, because there's frustration across the sector, both public and private. But this conversation should never be, and I say this, should never be a question of tenant versus landlord or landlord versus tenant. So good legislation doesn't have to be anti-landlord and doesn't have to be just pro-tenant. It's about a balance, and I think that's what we need. And we need to take some of the blunt instruments out, blunt instruments that do make for good headlines from time to time, but then also look within the bill and don't dismiss every element of the bill for looking at some parts of it that I actually think would do absolutely have merit, like in relation to the bill seeking to include a lending or financial institution in the definition of a landlord. Absolutely. There should be no issue with that. That was something that we've proposed as a party ourselves. That's something that I would like to see in the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill. I'll go on to that for a sec, but first if I could go to the USI, and thanks indeed for coming here again today. My colleague Deputy Casey has outlined a couple of things. I would be more than hopeful that in the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill that Government are bringing forward, that we had a private session on a couple of weeks ago. As Pat said, we have a bill that we published last year that clearly defines purpose-built student accommodation, which is defined in the Planning and Development Act. So it can be done. We can bring in licence to reside. We've lost a year on this, and I would say that, and this committee is unanimous in ensuring that students are given the protection they deserve, that a licence to reside also falls under that Act, and that they get the protection of the RPZs. My understanding is that will be brought forward in this bill. We've had a private session on it, but if it's not, and I've said this to Minister Murphy, and I know in fairness to Sinn Féin, my colleague Eoin Ó Broin in Sinn Féin has also said, and we have agreement, that if Government don't bring that forward, they will bring amendments to the bill and get them passed. And in fairness, the Labour Party and others as well have agreed to do that. So students will get that protection that they need. It's not enough, Michelle, right? And I know that, Megan, as well. There's more needs to be done, but it's been quite torturous to get to this stage, but we'll get there, and I think is one of the job of the committee is to deal with things, in a structured way and in a way that will actually work. I could produce bills every day of the week that will make big pronouncements on certain things, but if they're not actually implementable, and if they're not legal, and if they're not constitutional, well then I think all we're doing is that we're leading people down a garden path and we're giving false hope there. One thing that I would say, as I said already, the lending financial institutions absolutely should be there within the definition of landlord. The issue of supply is a major issue across public and private. To take the private landlords out of it for a moment is that the state to provide public housing, the state to provide cost rental, the state to provide housing as well, and that has been very slow. We lost over 4,000 landlords in the market last year, or 6. And, you know, that is an issue. There's lots of good landlords out there. That's a major issue. I see it in Dublin Fingal, my own area, which is one of the youngest areas in the country. 30, 40 different couples going to view individual apartments. And that's where the predominance of people, as John, Mark and Margaret will know, of coming into homelessness are coming through the private rental sector. So it is part of the solution. So the idea to actually make it more difficult for people to come in by the other element of the bill, which is just simply a blanket no to eviction, I don't think will work. I understand, you know, and I just don't see it. I think it will have an unintended consequence of actually driving more people out of the market unless the state can pick up that slack and actually say, well, you know, we're going to house people, and I believe the state should, by the way, and I've always been a supporter of public housing. So look, I think I sense the frustration from Tom and from Margaret, well, from Tom, from you in particular. I don't think I have to be that perceptive to sense the frustration there. And I also, in fairness, recognise Deputy Barry's restraint during that too. But what I would say is, I think all of us ourselves have pieces to solve the problem, and that's it. From the advocacy groups, from thresholds, from students, from property owners, from the state itself, it is doable. But we need to strengthen tenants' rights. And the one thing I wanted to say is that, as part of the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill, my own party has tabled over 25 amendments to that now, which would strengthen tenants' rights, and we need to strengthen tenants' rights, but strengthen them in a sense that that is real and is tangible. But we also need to make sure that we're not driving people out of the market unless the state can step in and do it itself. What I'm anxious, Caherly, is that we had that private session 2 weeks ago where we went through with Minister Murphy quite a lot of detailed amendments, and the reason we did that across party, all the members here in the room, it's important you know that, in private session, was to try to gain agreement to expedite the process. Now, the government have said they want the bill passed by the 19th of April. I'm kind of concerned now already that it's been 2 weeks since that meeting, and we haven't moved it on further. So maybe, Caherly, you may have it's a question for you really to see whether do we know when this bill is coming back in, because I think that will help. In the budget, I would say as well that there were measures that were brought in that were criticised by other parties. I actually made a suggestion for incentivisation of long-term leases for the very reason of, in real terms, trying to strengthen existing tenants' rights, and other parties here criticise it as a boon to landlords. That's not the reason that I was trying to do it. I was trying to do it to make sure that longer leases were actually offered, because that's a big problem in Ireland at the moment. So, look, I've kind of gone off on one there a bit, but I think it's an important pre-legislative scrutiny, and this committee stage here, I think is very important, and that's why we wanted to make sure that this bill came in, because there's aspects of the legislation brought forward by Deputy O'Sullivan and, in fairness, by Deputy Barry that do have merit. There's other elements of it that we don't agree with, and that's why it's important that this is done in a public session, so that everyone's views here are on the record, and we can take that on board as we move it forward, particularly with the government bill, I think, that should be coming forward hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, Darragh. I just have a couple of comments to make, because Deputy Casey is going to take the chair because I have to go to another housing meeting. But just to say, I know Darragh abstained. I actually voted against this bill, as you know, Mick, because I believed it was unfair and unconstitutional. And so, for various reasons, we did have a meeting with the RTB 2 weeks ago, a private meeting, and with the Minister, like Darragh said, to tease out these issues. And we actually we resolved a lot, including student accommodation. We got a lot of clarity around refurbishment. And we actually really moved forward within this. With the heads of bill for Brexit, the omnibus bill, all drafts, people have been pulled towards that for the next month. But I would presume that bill will come back to us ASAP, whenever that may be. Tom, I hear your frustration, and I agree with the majority of what you're saying. I do believe the cost rental will be a game changer from the state becoming a major landlord, coming forward with supply in the market as well, and it is about the right supply in the market. But going back to the figures that you gave us around daft, in 2012 8,500 properties available to rent versus 2,800 last December. If we had those 6,000 properties, those 6,000 landlords that left the market in 2017, we'd be back up. So that's how fragile this sector is. And it is, like, I sat through the legislation when we brought forward the rent pressure zones over 2 years ago. I sat in the chamber, I heard all arguments from all sides. I heard very little other solutions or other options. I'm opposed to it being linked to the CPI. Is it annual? Is it yearly you want to link it to? I think you need to give, landlords do take a risk. And CPI doesn't take into account all the additional costs that you have mentioned, and we have to be real about that. And I'm not talking about the big commercial landlords, I'm talking about the landlords that own one or two or a couple of properties who have the majority in this area. So I think this is something you have to tread carefully, and back then when rent pressure zones came in, we said this is about treading carefully, and I was protecting the rights of landlords and tenants equally here, that one doesn't become bigger than the other here. So we do have to be really careful how we proceed with any legislation when it comes to people's rights. When it comes to, we are here to scrutinise the bill that is before us. And I would just like to hear, Deputy Barry said he provided us with the legal advice that he received, and Deputy O'Sullivan had legal advice, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, but providing us with that legal advice. But I would just like to hear, because when we have a government bill, it goes through various legal processes before it can even come to the Dáil floor, and it's scrutinised before it comes to any member in the House, and it's different when it's a private member's bill. But can I ask around the compensation in Deputy Barry's bill? I'm opposed to this, but that 6 months compensation be given to anybody selling a property, and we differ on what the determination of an eviction is. To me, a valid eviction or a valid notice to quit is somebody giving their proper notice of period of time to find another property, and when they're within that legal parameters. You know, Deputy Barry, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this wants compensation in that area, and I think that's unjust. And I would just like to hear your feedback on that. When it comes to student accommodation, I think we're making great steps towards that, and it does the massive issue of supply, and I'm glad you alluded to the amount of student accommodation that has been delivered and where we are going, and obviously we need to go far further than that. But around including them in rent pressure zones, we're coming a long way in that, and I think you'll be happy with what you see coming forward. When it comes to selling a property, I'm wholly against. I think landlords, if they want to sell their property, that's within their right, once they were again within the legal parameters of the notice to quit, the termination periods that are there. And if they want to sell it with the tenant in situ, they're well within their rights to do that. I think it goes too far when we say they have to sell it with the tenant in situ, and I would be wholly against that. And I think it pushes us one side over the other. And like Darragh said, it's not about pitching landlords against tenants or vice versa. This is about trying to have a functioning rental sector that is only starting to mature now. We have a lot of catching up to do. And when it comes to supply, we don't need to go back over the past, but with the population growth that is prospected, with Brexit, you know, we know what's coming down the line here. We know that we're running to stand still, but we're making great strides in this area. And I don't want any legislation coming forward that pushes landlords again out of the market, that exacerbates the issue that we have before us here. But it is about rights. It's about equal rights here on both sides. So I would just like to hear some of your views around some of the legislation that is being proposed here, and what your response would be, Tom.
Sorry, Chair, just before you take that. Chair, there was a very pointed criticism levelled at me earlier on. Now, I don't want to take a huge amount of time of the meeting, but I do want to take 2-3 minutes of the meeting before we conclude
no problem, Mick.
to be able to reply to those points, whether it's now or later.
No problem. You're coming in the next round, but Jan, I have you down. So, Tom.
Just on the point of compensation, and we've heard an awful lot about balance and the importance of balance, but there's no balance in the current bill that's before the House, and we've been here and we've highlighted why there is no balance. Tenants can sit in properties, not pay rent. They can challenge and appeal through the RTB without having to put up any funds or put the rent in escrow in the event that they lose their case. And landlords are expected to wait 12-18 months to get their cases heard. So there's no balance in that. There's RPZs that have been introduced retrospectively, and landlords who were very fair in tenants and hadn't increased their rent have no redress to bring their rents up anywhere near market value. So there is no balance, and there has been no balance in all discussion here so far. On the issue of compensation, we've all had it. We've had tenants who sign up for a year's contract and they leave after 6 months. So I'm presuming, and I'm saying this, I'm not saying this facetiously, but I'm presuming if a tenant leaves before their lease is up and they leave at the end of month 6 and they're contracted for a year, that they'll owe the landlord the last 6 months of the rent as well under the proposal that we have, so that there'll be compensation going both ways in the interest of balance. And equally, I'm presuming in relation to RBZ, although I know it's not a feature of this here, that when we have another downturn again, similar to what we had in 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and when rents slid by 50%, I'm presuming that the RPZ measures will apply on tenants as well, in that the decrease will be limited to 4% every 2 years. And, you know, because if we're having balance, we should have balance on all sides. And so that's really all I have to say.
Thank you. Michelle, you want to come back in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to address a couple of the comments that Deputy Casey and Deputy O'Brien particularly mentioned around RPZs, and it's absolutely brilliant to see, you know, that cross-party support coming forward with those kind of those measures being introduced. I suppose the legislation we started this process last year. There's a lot of fear amongst the people that I represent on how long this process is taking. We're seeing already particular instances in Cork and Galway where already the prices for next year are coming out, and we're seeing drastic increases of 20% and 10% increases. So obviously we absolutely recognise the work of this committee and the work of the different parties that are bringing forward that legislation, but we do want to note that we are concerned at how long that it's taking. So as well as that, we mentioned, like, you know, the supply issue, and that there was great. It was great to see that some of that supply was being provided in the last year. But actually, the problem is these new builds are coming onto the market at absolutely unaffordable prices, at €1,000 a month. So we talk about supply, but what kind of supply are we providing for students? It's completely unaffordable. We should be looking at other models like cost rental, as you mentioned, or perhaps capital grants for campuses to actually build their own student accommodation on campuses. So that's kind of where we stand on that. The 4% rent pressure zones, as Deputy Alice did allude to, it is too late for the 4% rent pressure zones when these prices are coming on, or these places are coming onto the market at €1,000 a month. So the 4% it's too late, but do you know what? We'll absolutely take that now, because that's all we have. And if we're seeing 20% increases year on year, 4% is definitely a welcome measure. Thank you.
Anne-Marie?
Yes, so we just wanted to come in and say something there in relation to the compensation piece that's proposed in the anti-evictions bill. So it's proposed that if a landlord issues notice of termination on grounds of a family member moving in, there would be the equivalent of 6 months' rent paid as compensation to the tenant. So this does exist in other European countries. It's usually expected the landlord and tenant agree between themselves, and there are restrictions on it. As it's proposed currently in the anti-evictions bill, you could see a tenant who's only lived there 1 month receive notice and then get this compensation, which does seem excessive. It also does seem like a harsh levy to place on a landlord who may be in genuine need of that property. And if it is a case that this has been brought in to hopefully prevent landlords abusing that ground for termination, there may be better mechanisms to do so. As part of the Department's review of Building Ireland 2017, it was proposed landlords will be required to notify the RTB when issuing a notice of termination, and as a measure to prevent the issue notice on false grounds, it could be expanded to include a verification process by the RTB. Or another option may be that a signed declaration is required from the family member as well as the landlord to accompany the notice of termination. And in addition, with the forthcoming bill proposed by Government, this could be included in the Schedule 2 of the RTB bill, so that the RTB can investigate if they believe a notice of termination has been issued falsely on grounds of a family member moving in. So while we do see an abuse of that grounds, we're not so sure that the compensation will be a sufficient way of tackling that. And as most landlords only own one property, it would be quite an expense for them to pay such compensation.
Anne-Marie. John, Mark, do you want to come in anything there? No, Margaret?
One of the items that I find worrying is that we're talking about average rent all of the time. We do not know what the average rent is in this country. The index from DAFT deals with the last 3 months and its incoming tenants and its new tenancies. The RTB index reflects, again, the last 3 months. So it only includes the last 3 months. So you do not have the average amount of rent from that. So if we're looking at most people are in their properties much longer than that. The average tenancy now is 3 years. So the registration will capture that. But at the moment, we're basing all of legislation on average rents that are wrong and incorrect. So that needs to be addressed. It really does need to be addressed. The deposit situation. We need to have a deposit that is sufficient to warrant the risk that's been taken. So if we let a property is extremely expensive to purchase. It is huge for most landlords, and again, we're looking at 2/3 of the market is provided by landlords with less than 3 properties. If damage is done, there has to be a mechanism to actually get some of that back. There has to be some sort of recourse. So in a situation where we have 1 month's deposit, if they don't pay the last month's rent, that's gone. If they don't pay their rent, we have to start serving notices in any case. We have to follow the legislation as the legislation is written. So we have to give the warning letters and the notice of termination. If they don't leave after that, we have to go to the OTB. So we're looking at a huge risk on anybody that takes in a tenant at any time is under a huge risk. Now, we know the vast majority of tenants are good, and we know the vast majority of landlords are good, but it is up to a landlord to decide how much deposit is required and how much they are comfortable and what's their risk. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, if the damage is done and the rent isn't paid, there's nothing. There's no recourse if somebody has no income. So if somebody moves into accommodation and has no income, then there's no recourse for the landlord at all. There's no protection. The state doesn't protect the landlord. The tenant is state. The tenant is protected by the state. The landlord cannot evict that tenant until the processes are done. In a case where the rent is not being paid, it is just fundamentally unfair, and it is a huge risk. The CPI doesn't reflect the cost of providing accommodation at all. It doesn't. The rent pressure zones were brought in and with all good intentions, but they've had dark consequences for a lot of people. If your rent was substantially below market rent, then you couldn't increase it. We were looking at the rents having decreased substantially for a long time prior to the from around 2012, 13, 14, 15, when they started to come back up. We had the 2-year cap put on it by the Minister. As soon as that cap was lifted, we had a situation where there's a lot of people who would have been substantially below market rate, not in a position to actually keep subventing their properties. And as a result, they themselves have had to sell properties. Last call yesterday that I took was somebody that has a property, a 3-bedroom house up in Drogheda. €600 was the previous rent with the previous person. That person has left. Landlord cannot afford to subvent it anymore. HAP wanted for $1,200, and that's below market rent. Landlords can't do it. They're breaking the rent pressure zone laws. That property is going up for sale. It's just the rent pressure zones. There's nothing in the legislation anywhere that addresses people that are substantially below market rent. And there's unintended consequences, and the unintended consequences are we're losing properties.
Thank you. John, and then Mick.
And first of all, can I apologise? I had 2 oral questions in there as well, and while I was here for my original presentation, I had to go away, but I have read your presentations. And can I also just, in relation to Tom's comments when I came in, and I think the Chair has dealt with this, but I mean, this is a bill presented by me and a bill presented by Deputy Barry. It's not the committee's. The committee has different views on our bills. They're simply holding hearings on our bills, so anything criticism on the bills should be directed to myself and Deputy Barry, I think, rather than to everybody on the committee. I just want to just raise a couple of things, and maybe first of all to go to the student issue, and just obviously it's not in my bill. The Sinn Féin bill and the Fianna Fáil bill were both published just around the time when my bill was published, and we're dealing with the student issue. Mine isn't totally comprehensive, but I absolutely supported their bills, and as the Chair has said, the Minister has also told us that the issue of student accommodation is going to be dealt with by way of amendment to his bill. And to be absolutely frank about it, his bill is much more likely to go through more quickly than any of us in the opposition, because it tends to take an awful long time to get an opposition bill through the Houses of the Oireachtas. So we'll work with the Minister in relation to that issue. So, I mean, just I suppose that's on that issue. In relation to the threshold, and just to thank you for, you know, your ongoing, I suppose, information in relation to the issues that come to your attention. And you also gave us some data in relation to the Minister's bill, which is very helpful. And in that context, earlier on in our earlier presentation, it was actually yourself and the Chair now, Deputy Casey, who raised the issue of data and what accurate data we have. And just maybe you might be able to help us with that in regard to, you know, different organisations have different data about reasons for people becoming homeless. And I suppose the committee wants to try and gather it together and get as much accurate information as possible. But I specifically wanted to ask you about I think you put it into the documentation in relation to the Minister's bill, but that in this thing that there would be an obligation to inform the Residential Tenancies Board when a termination notice is being issued, and then the Residential Tenancies Board would inform the tenant, so that the tenant would know, you know, that there were certain things they could do, including go to the local authority, and also I think the local authority should be informed. And as far as I know in Britain, and maybe you can clarify, and I know Tom referred to the UK, but I think there is an obligation to notify the local authority well in advance when there's a risk of homelessness, so that the local authority can respond appropriately, rather than wait until the tenant becomes homeless. So just if you can just give us any clarity on that, that would be welcome. In relation to then the issues that are of concern particularly to landlords, just to say, first of all, when I was quoting, and I don't know if you heard my opening statement or read it, but I submitted it in writing as well to the committee. But when I was talking about the examples that we got from the library in relation to Europe, private rental sector and international comparative study, they did include the UK incidentally, but I was quoting from Germany, and I specifically read into the record, as well as talking about the fact that 41% of the housing stock is privately rented. And it is considered a secure and long-term option, and that's, you know, a lot of the measures in my bill are around giving tenants security so that they can have a secure and long-term option in the private rented sector, and I absolutely defend that in my bill. But I did also say that it is pointed out that the law benefits landlords as well as tenants. There are depreciation allowances, mortgage interest tax relief, deduction of maintenance costs, and the possibility to deduct losses from the income tax base. But they're all taxation measures. They're not measures that would be in any bill that would come before that would be presented to the Housing Committee. So I suppose just to kind of say that, you know, we're being accused of anti-landlord. We do recognise that there are issues for landlords as well, but they're not in this bill, because this bill is about protecting the rights of tenants and giving them security of tenure. And, you know, in this very changing and catching up market in loads of ways, like where we had a collapse of the economy and houses not being built, absolutely support you that the main thing we need is for publicly led construction of houses, social and affordable. That's our policy. But in the meantime, you know, we have to protect tenants in the very fragile situation that they're in, where they don't have any long-term security, and you know, you've got to look at it from their perspective as well as from the landlord's perspective. And in that regard, I would say, in relation to Margaret's point about the deposit and the risk to the landlord who has paid big money for the property he's renting, he or she is renting, there's a risk to the tenant as well. I mean, if the tenant doesn't get their deposit back, they've no deposit for their next tenancy. So, you know, there's a balance of risk there too. And I mean, I certainly know of cases where a tenant didn't get back there from the letting agency. The letting agency said, oh, well, I can't get the deposit back from the landlord because the property has been sold, I'm just letting it. And I certainly know cases where tenants who had done nothing wrong to the property didn't get their deposit back. So, you know, there's a balance there as well. And in terms of the Constitution, and again, when I was making my presentation, I put it in the context of constitutional balance between property rights and the public good. But, you know, in that regard, there's very little security for people who are in the private rented sector, who, you know, through no fault of their own, have to rely on the private rented sector, because there isn't enough supply in the public sector at the moment, and we could all, go back on the reasons for that. So I suppose they're the main points that I wanted to make. I don't know if there's anything else. On notification of the RTB. Just on the legal advice, I think the Chair has already dealt with that, but my legal advisor was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately couldn't be here. But what we are trying to do is to deal with the real situation that tenants find themselves in, and the measures in my bill are fairly specific. And sorry, I knew there was one other thing I wanted to refer to. It's the rent register. And again, the Minister has said that he's going to bring forward proposals with regard to a rent register. I agree with threshold. I think it does need to be dwelling specific. And I do believe that, and we have it in our bill, that it will not contain information that it will not, disclose the identity of the landlord or the tenant of the dwelling. So, we are saying that a prospective new tenant should know how much the actual property, how much rent was charged previously on the actual property. But we're specifically saying that it would not contain the identity of the landlord or the tenant.
Thanks, Jan. Mick.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to address my remarks to the representatives of the Irish Property Owners Association, and particularly to Mr. O'Brien, who levelled a degree of criticism towards my contribution earlier on. One of the charges that was made was a charge of an ignorance or a certain ignorance of the sector. I don't believe that to be the case. However, I offered you an opportunity to enlighten me and to enlighten the committee as regards the claim that you made in your presentation that the threat of withdrawing selling as a ground for termination has already resulted in some investors leaving the market. We have a bill here which is at the early part of stage 3 of progressing through the houses of the Oireachtas. I expressed some surprise that the content of those bills would be forcing a flight of capital at this point, and I asked you to provide evidence. You provided evidence about investors leaving the market. I didn't hear any evidence about people leaving the market because of the possibility of sale as grounds being removed as grounds for eviction. Maybe you might enlighten me on that when you reply after I speak. Now, I'll tell you one thing that I am very aware of. I'm very aware of the people who crowd out my constituency clinic every single Monday morning and have done for the last weeks, months, and well beyond that. The stories that people bring to me about how they've received a notice to quit because their landlord is selling the property. These are oftentimes family people, people with young children who feel, with some reason for feeling it, that they are on the verge of being evicted into homelessness. I'm very well aware of the people from, I'll give an example, of one block of apartments, 15, 16, 17 families who approached me. Some of them crowded out my clinic, and they said, where are we going to go? What are we going to do? Our landlord, a vulture fund, is evicting us on the grounds of the renovation of the property. And renovation of the property in order to get around the RPZ and to hike up the rents and to go for a more affluent tenant. Right? Now, they fought a battle in relation to that and they pushed back. All right? And that's very much to their credit that they have done that. All right? There are people who come to me who are extremely upset, people who come to me who are crying. Everyone here has had that experience, right? And you said that I should do my job. Well, I tell you what I'm doing here today. As far as I'm concerned, I am doing my job, because it's my job to represent the woman who comes to my office with the eviction notice, and it's my job to represent the family who are facing homelessness because of the threat of a rent eviction in order to make more profit for a vulture fund. Your job might be to represent other people, fair enough, but that's my job, and I do it, and I am doing it today. Next week, Chair, if the number of people joining the homelessness lists for January are anything like January 2018, 2017 or 2016, the numbers of people officially homeless in this state will go over the 10,000 mark. The 10,000 mark for the first time in the history of the state. And Threshold tell us, and other organisations doing similar work tell us, that the #1 cause of homelessness in the state today is eviction from the private rental sector. That's a fact, unchallengeable, uncontestable fact. And what I'm saying today is that it is insanity to continue to allow these evictions to take place in the midst of the largest housing and homelessness crisis in the history of the state. And the bill aims to staunch the flow with strong, practical, from the point of view of ordinary people, reasonable measures, such as banning sale of property as grounds for eviction, as we've established during these hearings, as is the case in law already in Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands and Denmark. And it seems to me that, you know, the highest rental investment profits in Europe are being made in Ireland. And, you know, whatever way you look at the figures, Ireland is up at the top of the table in that regard. And it's a bit much for me. There's a lot of sympathy been offered to the representatives of the IPOA here today, right? Well, it doesn't sit well with me to listen to the poor mouth for an hour or an hour and a half when when there are super profits, fabulous profits being made by many landlords in this country, including corporate landlords as well. And it seems to me that what is being said, and I'll finish on this point, is that if you bring the standards and the rights for tenants up to the level of other European countries, if you follow what is best practice for tenants' rights and entitlements, that the landlords are going to turn tail and flee the market. I think that there is a significant element of bluff in that in order to maintain and defend those rental profits. But I think if there's any degree of truth in it, what it actually points to isn't giving more tax breaks and concessions to landlords, but is for the need for the state to provide a genuine alternative in terms of a really significant and massive, in fact, investment in social housing to provide a roof over our heads with decent rights and conditions for our people. I'll leave it at that.
Just to make the committee aware, we still have another session to go through and we have to be out of here by 1:30. So in my final wrap up, I'll ask you if the members could restrict themselves to about 2 minutes. And I'll start with you, Tom.
Just to address Barry's comments there, he asked for evidence. What I did give him was clear evidence that there is a mass exodus of landlords leaving the sector on the back of ongoing tax and legislation changes that have been implemented and are currently going through the House. In relation to evidence of your particular measures in the bill, we can only go off feedback we get through our helpline in the IPOA. So since this bill has been announced publicly at the end of November 2018, we have been inundated with members ringing our office wondering, is this coming into law, when is it coming, and expressing that I'm particularly referring to the particular feature around selling not being a grounds for getting vacant possession, and that particular item has been both bills That particular item has been the subject of continual concern and discussion and phone calls to our offices in the IPOA. So there is absolute evidence, and we are closer to that than possibly you are, and so we can speak on behalf of property owners in that regard. You've mentioned your concern and discomfort at people crowding out your clinic in relation to being served with notices to quit. I mean, I don't know how you feel it is private landlords' responsibility to sort the homeless crisis. I mean, that is a state. The homeless crisis is a state responsibility. It is not for the private sector to resolve that. The private sector, without the private sector, the homeless crisis would be a lot worse, and I think they should get some gratitude and acknowledgement for the important role that they play. I stand by my comments in terms of the bill. The bill does nothing to sort the problem in relation to that we experience at the moment. If there was a serious intent to resolve the problem of housing in the country, all parties would be coming forward with incentivisation measures. If we look at Section 23, and you will get laughed out of court if you mentioned reintroducing Section 23, but Section 23, without it, we would be devoid of thousands of apartments in Dublin, Galway, Limerick, Athlone, Cork, and the housing crisis would be a hell of a lot worse than what it is now. So incentivisation and tax breaks are needed, as unpopular as they will be for you guys in terms of reaching out to your electorate and your support base. They're absolutely needed, and they're needed to be reintroduced ASAP. The last thing I'll make, because I've given you these figures before and I've talked you through, you've mentioned super profits in the rental sector before, and I thought I'd explained it the last time we met, but just to explain it again. If we take an apartment that's rented at €1,000 a month, okay, so we'll just talk about super profits now. So an apartment at €1,000 a month, that's 12,000 in gross rental income a year. The tax take out of that is €6,500 before you go anywhere, €6,500. LPT €300, service charge €1,500, and general repairs on average about €1,000 a month. That leaves you with €3,000 to service your mortgage. So the figures don't stack up, and hence, no, on an annual basis, €6,500 in tax. Yeah. €1,500 in service charge, €300 in relation to LPT, and €1,000 a year in relation to general repairs, washing machine going or whatever it is, plumber, electrician, you name it. That leaves about €3,000 a year to service your mortgage. The mortgage at that level will be running at about 12, 13, 14,000. So to say that there are super profits in rental is absurd, and is possibly the reason that we have all this sort of legislation coming through, which is anti-investor. It's probably the reason we have the supply issue. There is no return unless you have no mortgage. There is no return in the buy-to-let sector, and hence we need tax breaks to resolve that €6,500 hit that's there on a property-by-property basis. Tax breaks are needed, reintroduction of 100% mortgage relief, a special rate of income tax for rental of 20%. All of that's needed, and you'll find apartments and houses will come back to the market. People will stop selling, and without that, and without people facing up to the reality that property owners will need to be incentivised. They don't do this and take on financial, tenant and legal risk lightly. And without all of those measures, you will not have an increase in supply, and we'll be sitting here this time next year with the same issues, except you're correct, homeless figures will have gone up and the number of properties available for rent will have gone down. And we'll all be sitting here wondering why that is the case, when we've been here time after time, both in terms of we met Deputy O'Sullivan in her time as Housing Minister. We've been before this committee on 3 occasions at this stage. We've met the Minister for Finance and his representatives. We've met the Minister for the Environment and his representatives. Nobody wants to listen because there's no votes in landlords. There's not enough landlords for votes, and it's not populist to come out and say that you want to incentivise property owners. It's okay to incentivise Google, Facebook, every other business person in the country can get incentivisation in some sort, be it grants or whatever. Landlords cannot, because it's not populist. It's not a popular thing to do. There's no votes in it, and we all understand the reality of the situation. Okay, John. I'm concerned we need to move on, so I want to move to threshold now, and either John or Anne-Marie make their final statements.
So I'll just respond in relation to some of the question in relation to statistics and the reasons for homelessness. So what I suppose what I can start to speak on first is our own figures. So what we saw in 2017 was that 38% of the notices of termination brought to us were for the purposes of sale. 17% were for landlord moving in, 12% were in the grounds of renovation, 8% were on arrears. I'll just make a small comment on arrears. The vast majority of arrears cases that were brought to us, we were able to resolve successfully for a tenant and landlord. So that says to us is there is a way of resolving that and making sure neither tenant or landlord lose out. The tenant lose out in their home and the landlord lose out on their rental income. As regards then, I suppose, how we might determine the reason for homelessness, the DRHE had published some statistics on that in the last few years. What they would indicate is about 50% of those presenting as homeless were coming from the private rented sector. A further breakdown of that isn't available, but the information is there. Now, the Dublin Region Homeless Executive managed the PASS system on behalf of all the local authorities, so it is possible that they could extract that information, and that would come down to the local authorities entering the information on the PASS system in a regimented manner, but it certainly is possible to determine that. What we have suggested in relation to the bill proposed by government, and it is one of the recommendations in the review Rebuilding Ireland, is that all notices of termination be issued to the RTB as well as the tenant, and in that way the RTB themselves can monitor the reasons that tenants are receiving these notices of termination. Because as it stands, we don't have solid, reliable data, because obviously Threshold can only comment on the tenants that come to us, the IPOA can only comment on the landlords that come to them, and so on and so forth. But certainly, either through the DRHE or through the RTB, it is possible to start collating that information and making real decisions based on that. And I'll say one small thing, I suppose, just in relation to discussion about profits and what's left to service the mortgage. As it stands, somewhere between 30 and 40% of rented properties are under a buy-to-let mortgage. So while I do have the greatest sympathy for those landlords who are struggling to pay a mortgage, it is only about that percentage that are paying a mortgage, and interest rates are at their lowest, and so it's certainly not enough just to say, oh, well, they have to pay their mortgage. And Ireland at present has one of the highest rental yields in Europe, I think only second to Cyprus. So I suppose those are the final comments from myself.
Michelle or Megan? Megan, yep.
Firstly, just want to, I suppose, echo some of the sentiments Michelle expressed around the rent pressure zones extending to PBSA coming slightly too late. I mean, it's a source of great frustration, I think, to a lot of students that there would be a house 2 minutes down the road from their own accommodation where the rent can only go up by 4%, yet the purpose-built accommodation that they live in can jump by 25% overnight. And I mean, with student villages releasing information now, who knows, even before April, before this legislation can be enacted, how many more increases we'll see. So just wanted to note that. And secondly, just to come in on a few points Deputy O'Sullivan made. And it wasn't actually mentioned in our initial presentation, but particularly around deposits and why that 1 month issue would be very welcome, is that in a lot of student accommodations, moieties have to be paid up front, and that can be a massive chunk of money. We also experience many issues with students not being able to get deposits back. Or being discriminated against for particular things, say for example professional cleaning fees being outlined, but there's no real evidence or justification there. And then again, just to, I suppose, express support for the registry specific dwelling, because on dwelling specific, because as we mentioned previously, a lot of the information gathering has been left to students' unions, I suppose, to see the increases year on year. And just from our own data gathering, I mean, you can see the increases even 4 or 5 years back, and it's going up 3% per year. But now all of a sudden we're seeing these massive jumps of 20%, you know, and I suppose there's a lot of concern around a market that goes so unregulated as such. That brings it up to the market standard, and then where does the market go from there? So, there.
Okay. I would like to thank the witnesses for attending and engaging with the committee today. It was definitely lively, if nothing else. I propose we suspend the meeting for a few moments to allow our next set of witnesses to take their seats. Thank you all very much. Just a note on privilege before we start. At the request of broadcasting and recording services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient just to put phones on silent modes, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 8, detailed scrutiny of the Anti-Eviction Bill 2018 and Residential Tenancy Greater Security of Tenure and Rent Certainty 2008. In our third session today, we resume detailed scrutiny of the Anti-Eviction Bill 2018 and Residential Tenancy Greater Security and Tenure of Rent Certainty Bill 2018. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome from the Residential Tenancy Board Rosalind Carroll, Karen Gallagher and Katrina Walsh. Just a note on privilege. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are only entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or identity by name or in such way to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official leader by name or in such way as to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Katrina Walsh to make the opening statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Chair and Joint Committee for inviting us, the RTB, to discuss the Residential Greater Security of Tenure Bill and the Anti-Evictions Bill. I'm accompanied today by the Director of the RTB, Rosalind Carroll, and Karen Gallagher, the Head of Communications and Research. The Residential Tenancies Board is the primary body dedicated to regulating the rental sector in Ireland and one of the only bodies that works impartially with landlords and tenants. Our core functions include replacing the courts for the majority of landlord and tenant disputes through our dispute resolution service. We have a national system of tenancy registration and increasingly the provision of information, research and education. The overall vision of the RTB is for a well-functioning rental sector that is fair, accessible and beneficial to all. However, we know that in the current market, demand continues to grow at a time of restricted supply and access to accommodation is difficult for many tenants. We also recognise that there are many people in very challenging and uncertain situations as a result of the ongoing supply and affordability issues. Given the number of households that rent in Ireland and will continue to do so into the future, we will need to continue to adapt the regulatory framework in a way that supports and serves both landlords and tenants in this evolving market. Both of the bills being discussed here today are about trying to improve the current situation in the rental sector. The spirit of both recognises the need to strengthen security of tenure protections to meet the needs of a rental population that will rent homes for much longer periods than previous generations. In terms of both timing and effectiveness, before considering further changes, it is important to note the level of regulatory change that has already occurred and the current profile of the sector. There have been a series of legislative changes introduced over the last number of years: the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act in 2015, another in 2016, and now we have another bill currently before the Houses. The original regulatory framework established in 2004 has grown and become more complex with each change, to the point that most landlords and tenants do not understand their rights and responsibilities. We believe that this is the biggest threat to successful implementation of any further regulatory change. The proposed new powers for the RTB under the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill No. 2 of 2018 will enable us to build on the protections in current legislation and allow us to move to more proactive regulation of the sector. However, we cannot rely on regulation alone to solve all of the issues, and we must also protect existing supply and encourage future investment. In this context, it is important to consider the current profile of the sector. There are approximately 340,000 tenancies registered with the RTB, of which 307,000 are private residential tenancies. The majority of landlords, just over 70%, own one property, with a further 16% owning 2 properties. We are starting to see in our own organisation evidence that the stock of rental properties is falling, despite demand being at an all-time high. Since 2017, the number of private rental tenancies has fallen from 313,000 to just over 307,000 at the end of 2018. This is a significant reduction, given the extreme demand pressures on the current market at this time, and we cannot afford to risk further loss of stock in the sector, as it is the most vulnerable tenants that are affected most by the lack of supply. Given the degree of regulatory change introduced over the course of the last 3 to 4 years and what is proposed, there is a careful balance to allow the legislation to bed in and allow the RTB to exercise new regulatory powers to manage the transition properly and to ensure that we do not worsen the situation, even with the best of intentions. The bills being introduced here today contain a wide range of measures, including student accommodation, rent transparency and rent reviews, changes to security of tenure relating to Section 34 and Part 4 of the Residential Tenancies Act, rent pressure zones and deposits. It's our understanding that a number of areas are under consideration as amendments within the context of the current bill, the Residential Tenancies Amendment No. 2 Bill 2018. With regard to student accommodation, the RTB came before the committee last November to discuss this issue. We support reform and clarity in this area, given the increasing number of student-specific accommodation that will be provided over the next number of years. The RTB strongly believe that the vast majority of student accommodation does currently fall within our remit, whatever it is called. And we understand that the Minister is working to include further clarity on student accommodation in the proposed legislation. In considering rent transparency, the proposed move to annual registration will ensure that landlords provide the RTB with up-to-date details on an annual basis, including correct rent amounts. This will ensure better and smarter regulation and will support rent transparency measures. It is our understanding that the Minister is working to establish, if it's legally possible, to provide for measures to ensure rent transparency in the sector. In considering some of the other measures, it's useful to look at the applications that we have for dispute resolution services coming to the RTB, which do tend to give an important insight into the sector. The most common types of dispute that we see on applications are in relation to rent arrears and overholding, 27%, invalid notice of terminations, 26%, and deposit retention, 21%, and this trend has remained steady for the last number of years. Now, since in 2017 we tried to drill down into the particular applications that were coming before us to try to see if we could give further clarification or information in relation to the types of disputes. And we have found that there are a wide range of reasons why notices of termination are being served. The most common reason is rent arrears. This is the biggest issue facing the sector. 44% of the notices in 2017 are served for rent arrears. 20% of them are served for the sale of the property, 8% of them because the landlord wishes to use it in the circumstances to move back into the dwelling a member of their family or extended family, and 8% for substantial renovations. There have been a number of legislative changes to enhance security of tenure in the last few years, and the RTB do support further strengthening in this area. However, there are legal considerations, and at this point, given the data that exists in relation to the supply in the sector and notices of termination, we need a careful balance and a strong evidence base to support further regulatory change. In relation to rent pressure zones and the criteria that apply, the RTB have fed into consideration by the Department. It is important to balance any potential impact on supply, particularly where rents are lower than the cost of provision. The RTB Rent Index, produced in conjunction with the ESRI, provides data on rental indices across the country, down to local electoral area. The quarterly report shows the degree of variation across the country in both growth rates and standardised average rents, and it's significant in some areas, with an average rent of €470. Outside of the rent pressure zones, there are rent certainty measures in place whereby landlords can only review the rent once in a 24-month period and cannot set a rent in excess of market rent. There are existing protections for tenants, and the RTB believes that with the additional new powers and a more proactive regulatory framework where we can go in and assess ourselves, landlords and tenants can be supported on a pathway to compliance. It's important to allow for the new powers to be established and tested. When considering the range of other measures proposed, the case outcomes and RTB experience are useful to consider, such as the practice and outcomes in relation to deposits. In 2017, 92% of deposits were partially or fully refunded to tenants who took a case to the RTB, and we do not see evidence in our data of a trend whereby landlords are seeking deposits of more than 1 month's rent. In summary, the RTB will soon have more effective powers that will change the nature of how we regulate the sector. Critically, the new civil sanctions regime allows for a proportionate response, from a caution all the way up to sanction of 15,000 to potential breaches of the law. These powers will make the regulatory framework more impactful and effective. However, regulation alone will not resolve the current issues in the sector. When considering further regulatory measures in the market, equally there is a need to ensure that there is a quicker and more effective access to justice where things go wrong in a tenancy. We also need to ensure that we're doing more to promote supply and to encourage further investment. The proposed new powers for the RTB under the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill 2018 are a significant change for us, the RTB as an organisation, and for the rental sector. We hope that a lot of the measures will address the issues in the sector and the legislation will enable more effective, proportionate and smarter regulation. We are focused on the successful and smooth implementation of the proposed legislation for both landlords and tenants in what is an extremely complex and bureaucratic regulatory framework. This will take time, and the RTB are committed to supporting all those involved in the sector, whether they are landlords or tenants, on pathways to compliance. Given the wide range of issues in the bills, we have focused on some elements of both, but welcome an opportunity to discuss further with the committee any issues arising, and I hope we can assist.
Right. Thanks, Katrina. And I meant to say apologies for holding you up outside for so long this morning. I'll start with maybe Mick and then Jan.
We're very tight for time, Chair.
Yeah, we are.
So I'm going to waive my rights. And I'll
okay,
defer to
Jan, and then Desi, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I recognise the tight time as well, so I won't comment. I'll just maybe focus on a couple of specific issues. You gave us some statistics there around deposit retention, for example, and rent arrears and the percentage of cases that deal with particular issues. Just wondering, I think if I heard you correctly, you said that 92% of cases in relation to deposit retention actually did return some element of the deposit. Just wondering, have you got statistics on the success or otherwise of the various cases? You know, in other words, if there are cases in relation to, you know, rent arrears or cases in relation to eviction on grounds of sale or whatever, termination on grounds of sale, sorry to use the correct terminology. If you could give us those statistics, that'd be useful, because we talked earlier on about not actually having, you know, accurate data in relation to a lot of the issues. That would be helpful, I think. The other thing about the complexity of the regulations, I mean, I did say when I was speaking on the Minister's Bill that actually it might be better just to totally rewrite the whole thing, because it's quite complex for people trying to deal with the amendments to amendments of bills and so on. But maybe that's just a comment. And just then, sorry, I had one other question I wanted to ask. Yeah, I suppose, I mean, maybe you can't comment on this, but one of the things that came up at the last session was a suggestion that that it was very onerous to be a landlord, you know, in terms of all the various costs involved. I don't know whether you can answer that, but it would be useful to know whether you have kind of, because you started off by saying you were impartial between the landlord and the tenant, whether you have any kind of evidence or information in relation to those claims that, you know, if there are any further impositions put on landlords that they're just simply not going to be able to cope with the financial pressures. It would be interesting to get a perspective on that from yourselves.
Thanks, Jan. Desi?
Yeah, sorry, and thanks very much for the presentation. I was just curious about, I know most of your dealings are between tenants and landlords, you know, and there's a proposal here about the receivers and the banks, you know, and how would you see that that sort of an engagement? I'm curious how that would work, and I can understand the reason for it being here, because obviously we're encountering this more and more. So maybe you'd be able to fill us in on that. It is interesting. An awful lot of the cases, as you've probably heard, that we get are people, you know, for sale of property and that, and you know, the landlords. How do you find when you're dealing with landlords? Or do you discover that, or do you find out that many of them are, or some of them are possibly selling for the sake to reconnect with another tenant, etc. You know, do you find that is out there? Because certainly we find it's out there in our own clinics that some landlords are just saying they're selling. And the issue here about the definition of a family member, which I think is very well needed, in my opinion. We really need to get down to the bottom, because this has been used so much. And the register, how much of an advantage that would give you in terms of having a proper register. We do have, and just finally, the other thing is in regards to landlords that aren't registered. Do you deal much with that situation, and do you find it's not, as far as I can see, very common, but we have had issues with people who haven't been registered as landlords? Okay.
Okay. Rosa,
starting with maybe Deputy O'Sullivan, the deposit retention scheme, as you said, yeah, 92% is our statistics on that. And I suppose what we've tried to do as an organisation, what Katrina said, is before we only had the statistics on what was coming into us, but not actually what was found in beneath that. And often we see applications coming in, people will tick every box in terms of they're afraid of not ticking a box, so the applications isn't necessarily a good demonstration of what the actual dispute underneath it all might be. So we have started as much as we can where we get to a hearing to find out what was the issue and what was the result of that. Specifically, we've looked at notices of termination because of and we've been looking at that data since 2017 for the first time. So we found from that where notices of termination are served for rent arrears, 78% of them are found to be valid. But where notices are served for sale, only 50% of them are found to be valid. Where they're served for landlords requiring them for their use or for their family members, 48% of them are found to be valid, and we can share these with you afterwards. And for the substantially refurbishment then, 74% are found to be invalid. And I suppose what I would say just in relation to that, I know you've both made proposals in regard to the refurbishment piece, where cases are coming before us, the law that's there does work. It's this question of getting people to come forward with cases, as you can see, that many of the cases are found to be invalid when they come through. They do not meet the threshold of substantial refurbishment in terms of the type of cases that are coming before us. So I hope that gives you, but as I said, we'd be happy to share those statistics. We're at the moment collating our 2018 statistics, and they'll be available within the next few weeks, and we can get those to you as well. Just in relation to the whole complexity of the bill, in terms of, yes, we feel that that is one of the biggest issues with regulating the sector at the minute, because people just simply do not know what they should be doing. And every time we bring in a new law, what normally happens is we get more non-compliance. And there's, I would say, different categories of landlords and tenants out there. There's people that knowingly don't comply, and then there's people that are just not getting it right. And what we're trying to do is support the people that are trying to get it right, and hopefully the new legislation in terms of the sanctions piece will give us the power, a bit like they have in a kind of revenue-based framework, where you work with the people that are trying to comply, but if people do not engage with you, you're going to be treating them in a much harsher fashion, and it gives us a whole new framework in terms of being able to deliver. Saying that, you know, the bill that's coming before us that the Minister has put forward is still adding complexity, and yes, we would like to see a new bill too. But there's this whole balance between how do we just get something in place now to deal with maybe some of the non-compliance around rent pressure zones and so on, And if we kind of started rewriting, I suspect it'll be another 2 or 3 years before we get anything moving on it. And I think that's the balance between all of this, isn't it? At this point, what we'd like to see is just to get some of this legislation in place and us getting some of the new powers. In terms of the whole issue of onerous to be a landlord, I think in the current market, in many circumstances, it's onerous to be a tenant and it's onerous to be a landlord. For us, what I'd be very keen on is everybody having an awareness that we need a diversity of our landlords. And the smaller landlords in Ireland have played a very important part in terms of price control, because small landlords have personal relationships with their tenants, and they do not charge the maximum rent. As they get to know their tenants over time, they might take account of that. It might be a communion year or whatever it happens to be, and they have a personal relationship. And so for me, one of the things we need to make sure that we have is that whatever frameworks we put in place allows for that diversity over time. And at the moment we do have that diversity, but it's starting to change in some areas.
Yeah, I think we were just saying in terms of the statistics, like that our figures are dropping in terms of the amount of properties that are in the rental market over the last 2 or 3 years. And I suppose with any body, there comes a saturation point in terms of regulation as well. There's only so much that you can regulate the sector before it reaches saturation point and people kind of say, well, look, I'm just not bothered with this anymore. This is just too much for me. I think we need to support both the landlords and tenants. And I think that in terms of the landlords, there is an awful lot that they need to comply with. There's a lot the tenants need to comply with as well, and they're on the hard end of the stick in terms of the relationship between the landlords and tenants. But yeah, we need to try and support both parties in the sector. They both are a crucial part in terms of, and the more successful their relationship, the more successful the sector.
Yeah, so to summarise, we've lost 12,000 units in stock overall since 2016, which in the current framework is a very difficult space. So we had 319,000 units in 2016 on the private rental side. We're now down to the 307,000, which is a concern for us. And why we would support further security of tenure measures, we'd like to see them coupled with some maybe reforms on the supply side to ensure that we didn't lose that diversity that I just spoke about. Because actually security of tenure isn't an issue at all for the institutional investors. They all will have no problem with sale, and when they sell, they'll sell with tenants in situ anyway. So it's just the risk there that you'll actually affect the more vulnerable. In terms of the security of tenure piece, one of the concerns that I have is that landlords may then start to pick tenants that they think are going to be short-term tenants, so students, people without family, that they think are more transient in the market, and that by bringing this in actual fact, people will start discriminating against certain elements of the market to give themselves room to be able to sell the market openly. At the moment, there would be a huge valuation issue. So we've had cases come before us in terms of the Tyrrellstown Amendment that came in the last set of legislation, and in that there was evidence provided of a 28% fall in the price in the value of a home when you sell it with a tenant in situ. We've also liaised with some of the financial institutions just to kind of get an idea in terms of where we are with valuations within that framework. And it ranges from between 20 to 30% in terms of the impact of selling with the tenant in situ. So what we'd like to see is a way of normalising that, so that then we can get to a point where we can have that security of tenure with the sale in situ. Maybe if we just move to Deputy, because I know everybody's pressurised for time, to put to Deputy Ellis's questions about receivers and banks. Yes, there are more and more receivers in the market. I think we probably have more clarity now than we would have had a few years ago in terms of this. And indeed, officials from the RTB have been on interdepartmental working groups to try and work on this particular issue. Just in terms of maybe to clarify, at the moment, a receiver does have an obligation in terms of ensuring the maintenance of the dwelling is upkept during the receivership period. It's not explicitly stated within the legislation, but what's explicit in the legislation is that the tenant has a right of offset if the maintenance isn't carried out.
In relation to their rent.
In relation to their rent. So therefore, it's implicit then that the receiver will have to go ahead and do them. What can't be provided for, and I don't think can be provided for legally, even if there is a change in legislation, is this issue of deposit, which comes up a lot, because a deposit was paid to the landlord, it was never paid to the receiver, and therefore the tenant will never be able to get their deposit back. The only person that they can get their deposit back from is the landlord, and you can't retrospectively change that within the legislative framework.
You could do a deposit retention scheme. You could you? You could hold the deposit.
You could withhold it, absolutely,
yeah.
And again, we're not in favour of deposit protection scheme, but as an organisation that I suppose has been given a significant amount of change to implement, I've had to advise the Minister that we simply could not implement all of the regulatory change and the deposit protection scheme at the same time. If the deposit protection scheme would mean us administrating €300 million worth of deposits, and I just feel at the moment there's so much other pressures within the market that we need to prioritise which ones we're going to address. And because the deposits coming into us, the cases are being dealt with well. If you take your case, it is proving worthwhile. That at the moment, I think it's better for the people who are afraid to come to us. So there are people within rent pressure zones at the moment who are afraid to take a dispute to us because they fear that there will be an action by a landlord and so on.
And I think the other thing in relation to deposit protection is we certainly don't want to do something that's going to delay either collecting the return of deposits to tenants. So when it's being done, it needs to be done as efficiently and as quickly as possible, because obviously that is not great for tenants. Yeah.
Just clarifying what you said about the deposit being paid to a receiver or as opposed to directly to the landlord. So there is a major problem in terms of if that goes to the bank or goes to some other second party, then you are in a serious situation that you can't pursue it. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, there's no legal way of pursuing it.
Okay.
No legal way of pursuing it against the receiver. You can take a case against the landlord, absolutely, in terms of the return of your deposit.
So in those cases, we will look for the landlord, and we have powers to search for landlords. In some cases, we've been successful in that, but obviously they may be in financial difficulties themselves and not able to pay over the money. But because the receiver has never received that money, they will not have an accountability for that. I don't believe, even within a legal framework of legislation, that you'll be able to overcome that. But that's a matter for the Attorney General as opposed to ourselves. That's just our interpretation maybe of the issue. Coming back to, you'd asked about definition of the family member. Yeah, we'd agree that you could certainly tighten up the definition of family member within the Act, nephew and niece and so on. That's there at the minute. Yeah, you could certainly look at that. You had asked also, I suppose, about whether people were truly selling their property, and I think there are a lot of occasions where people are truly selling their property, but we have, maybe since the introduction of rent pressure zones, seen more cases, particularly where people haven't gone through with that sale, and that's related to that figure where I said 48% are found to be valid, 52% are found to be invalid. And in those cases, the tenants have a right to come forward to us. There's penalisation within the Act and so on. They can apply to us for damages, but that's not necessarily going to get them back their home, which I think is really at the heart of what we're talking about here. We are currently working with the department and his officials in relation to seeing is there more that we can do around this particular issue in terms of potentially sanctions and things like that. Just in terms of the rent transparency piece and the public register, yeah, again, we're very supportive of that, and hopefully the Attorney General will give it the go-ahead, and we would certainly be hoping to facilitate that. And we think the annual registration, which again we had brought through to the committee, gives us the data, then allows us to publish it. So yeah, we're very supportive of that. You just then asked about registration of landlords and how much did we see in terms of enforcement. I suppose last year and the year before we sent out about approximately 15,000 letters to landlords where we would have thought there might have been some level of non-compliance. In general,
once that letter goes out, we get compliance straight away. But at the moment, we're quite limited as an organisation, so all of our data sharing is with state bodies. So that means it's more to do with people who are in receipt of rent supplement or HAP or RAS, and our visibility of the private market outside of that is very difficult, and we don't have investigative powers. One of the things that the new bill is going to give us is investigative powers, which means our ability as an organisation to actually pursue non-compliance will be greatly enhanced. So that's one of the things that will really help.
We don't have any idea, really, of how the possibility of how many landlords are out there that are not registered, and we don't have any figure around, have we?
So the only thing that you can look against is the census data.
Right.
But the census data now includes rental room scheme, it includes the housing assistance payment. We know that people in the housing assistance payment, having discussed this with the CSO, there's a lot of people that, because it's a self-reporting piece, would have reported themselves as social housing rather than private rental. So the data that we used to rely on isn't as reliable as it would have been. But as I said, we do feel that the new powers will help us overcome that, but it is difficult for us at the moment.
To give you statistics here.
Okay, can I thank everybody for today's contributions. Jana and Mick for indeed staying with us today in relation to their own bill, and to the RTB for coming in again for the second time within a fortnight. And if the Minister has his way, you might be in again in another fortnight or 3 weeks. So it's an area of huge concern, I think, to everybody around the table, and I think the committee has given the government the commitment that we will work with them in relation to their bill, while we all would like our own bills to go through. I think the political reality is the only bill that would successfully get across the line will probably be the Minister's bill, and it's all our interest to work with the Minister, and we have been doing that in private session here last week. So again, thank you very much for coming in. Sorry about the delay. We could probably spend another hour with you, but we just don't have it today. So I would like to thank the representatives from the RTB for attending today and engaging with the committee. The meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held Tuesday the 26th of February at 11 a.m, and the topic is affordable housing. Thank you very much.